This army commander completely humiliated the third prince, spitting insults and calling him trash and a common rat, all just because he's the son of a concubine. The boy is known for being weak and constantly taking abuse, but not this time. An oppressive, killing aura nearly crushed the soldier right where he stood. The prince calmly picked up a twig, declaring that such insults would be paid for with his life. But this story actually kicks off a little earlier. Meet Prince Kalian, the son of a servant and a lord, and third in line for the throne of Karis, the most powerful nation on the continent. He's frail, constantly belittled, and utterly isolated within the palace walls. His half-brothers barely even acknowledge he exists. The knights treat him like a stray rat, and even the servants walk on eggshells around him. What no one knows, though, is that something has fundamentally shifted in that fragile body. This is no longer the same Kalian. This is Baron Sarakria, a king who lost everything in his past life. Baron ruled Sarakria with iron strength and honor, until an artifact known as the Time Axis appeared in his palace, triggering a catastrophic war. Kalis demanded the artifact, and Sarakria refused. The war ignited in a heartbeat. As if Kalis had been waiting for any excuse, Baron fought to his final breath before being cut down by Commander Arsene. On that blood-soaked battlefield, the man pulling the strings was none other than the Mad King of Karis Planche. Then Baron woke up here, 10 years before the war, trapped in the body of a prince from the very country that would destroy him. He has a narrow window of opportunity, and it's closing fast. The original Kalian is set to be assassinated in a month or two, before he even hits 15. The person who ordered the hit is the queen herself. Baron knows it. He also holds a secret that not even his most loyal servants are aware of. Kalian was a mage with 3 mana circles hidden near his heart. But channeling that power causes agony so intense it could kill him before an assassin even lays a hand on him. Time is running out. Baron makes his first real move. Stop hiding. He shears off his own hair. He stops staring at the floor, and when Planche flings a knife at his servant during breakfast, Baron snatches it out of the air with his bare hand. Blood drips as he smiles. Then he quietly places the blade right next to Planche without saying a single word. The second prince is completely rattled. He doesn't know how to handle this version of his brother. He's never seen a look like that before. But the next move is the real turning point. On the training grounds, Commander Pablo, a knight, fiercely loyal to Planche's faction, calls Kalian a bastard in front of everyone. The old Kalian would have shrunk against the wall and apologized with a nervous grin. Instead, Baron picks up a tree branch, asks Pablo exactly what his duties are, and before the commander can even finish his retort, he's already blurred past him, armed with nothing but that twig. He knocks the veteran commander's sword right out of his grip. Pablo drops to his knees and starts begging for mercy at the top of his lungs, right in front of his own men. As he's babbling on, swearing he never intended to commit treason, Baron just stares down at him with icy contempt. Still kneeling, his face pressed toward the dirt, Pablo realized he would never, ever forget the humiliation inflicted on him by the third prince. Jan Baron's servant asked with a look of pure shock why someone who went out for endurance training had returned leading a horse. The servant finished his sentence, just as Baron cheerfully held a massive black stallion by the reins. Baron handed the reins to Jan, mentioning he found the horse on the way, and that its name was Corbo. Jan asked where Baron had been once. The whole chaos between the prince and the commander had settled. Baron had spotted the horse and asked what was wrong. The stallion was resisting the knights because no one could tame it. It was a vicious, powerful beast, so the prince got an idea, remembering that the horse belonged to Planche. His servant Jan was floored that Baron had brought back Planche's own horse. The prince simply said that Planche had given anyone permission to use it, and whispered to his trainer to keep quiet about what happened to Pablo. With a trembling voice, Jan voiced his fear that the second prince would find out. But Baron, he reassured him, telling him that everything would turn out fine, no matter what happened. Baron then felt a sharp pain in his heart once again, which made both of his vassals jump in alarm. Clutching his chest, Baron figured he had pushed his body a bit too hard. His servant asked if the endurance training was too much for him, but the prince replied that it wasn't. He was just having a bit of fun with someone who had been secretly watching the three of them, and quickly slipped away to avoid being noticed. While Baron told Jan to go have dinner at a garden gazebo, a person sitting nearby was receiving information from another figure who was holding a flower in their hands. They declared that even worms will squirm when you step on them. Then they crushed the flower with force and stated that no matter how hard someone like Baron tried to squirm, he could never change his roots, tossing the flower to the ground. They remarked that simply crushing him to death wouldn't be very fun, and for now, they were content just to watch. Once again, the three princes were gathered for another meal. Baron thought he would never get used to it. This suffocating atmosphere, even though he was there every single day. Prince Planche was acting differently than usual. With a pensive look, Baron noticed and wondered why Planche seemed so discouraged that day. Everything. As he sipped his wine, Planche worried if the Queen and the Viscount were late because of him struggling to keep his expression in check. Suddenly, the dining room door swung open. Everyone rose from their chairs and turned their gaze toward the entrance, while Baron caught a scent that felt strangely familiar. Baron was actually quite glad to see the person entering the dining hall. It was the dazzling Queen in a green gown, her sky-blue hair flowing. Selenity Bryson, the second Queen and the true ruler of Curis. She was the real power behind the throne. After the previous Queen passed away from illness, Selenity seized the position, using her family's influence to seize control of the royal knights. Most of the nobles also backed the Bryson family, and so Cales's power grew stronger with every passing day. Consequently, the third prince, Caliane, became nothing more than an insignificant figure even to a lowly commander. The Viscount who entered with the Queen informed her of how he had dealt with Pasbel, and she confirmed she would provide him with proper compensation. Seated at the table, the Queen told the Viscount not to report such trivial matters in the future, and he replied that he understood. As the Queen looked at Baron, she wondered why she even had to concern herself with such small things. Baron just stared back at her with a cold, serious expression. Everyone at the table remained silent, simply watching the events unfold. The Queen then called out to the third prince, Caliane, who turned his gaze toward her. She remarked that he had grown quite a bit lately. Caliane offered a faint smile that caught the Queen off guard, given how unexpected his reaction was. Holding his wine glass, he replied that he hadn't grown all that much yet. Caliane finished with a smile, affirming that he would certainly grow much more in the future. The other two princes were stunned by his response. The Queen glared at him with a hint of irritation at his reply. The Viscount then declared with great enthusiasm that it didn't matter how much Caliane had grown. While he was speaking, Planche shot a sideways, furious look at Baron. The Queen whispered to her son, asking why he hadn't told her anything. Planche, confused, asked her what she was talking about. She explained it was about his horse not obeying his commands. Planche didn't immediately grasp what his mother meant. When he finally understood, Planche turned his head away, embarrassed by what had just happened. The Queen then said it would have been fine if he had told her sooner, but Planche replied that she already knew. Planche gripped his fork in anger, while the Queen insisted that he had never mentioned the horse was failing to respect his orders. He then slammed his fork onto the table, declaring that the horse had been useless from the start. Then, Planche stood up from his chair and announced he was leaving. His mother, the Queen, was taken aback by his attitude and called out his name. 3 weeks passed, and the king's birthday arrived. All the vassals were pulling out all the stops, determined to make sure the celebration went off without a hitch. A parade of horses arrived, hauling mountain-high piles of gifts for the king. Everyone was buzzing with anticipation for a truly legendary banquet. The kingdom's residents were whispering among themselves, wondering if the princes were even ready for the big day, and a heavy sense of unease hung in the air. Meanwhile, the royal tailor was busy double-checking the measurements he'd taken earlier for the third prince, Caliane. He frowned, noticing the numbers didn't match up at all. He was just about to ask Caliane if he'd been eating well lately when he was cut off. A sudden sharp drop of blood splattered onto the floor. The tailor's blood ran cold the moment he looked up at Prince Caliane's face. Prince Caliane was bleeding profusely from his nose, looking completely frazzled, and the vassals scrambled instantly to rush to his side. Stained with blood, the prince's servant barked at another vassal to grab a cloth, while Kalyan stubbornly insisted that it was really no big deal. Kalyan tried to brush it off, claiming he'd just been having a rough time catching some shut-eye these past few days. But Zhang, his loyal attendant, shot him down, saying that wasn't the real issue, right before the tailor cut in. The tailor pointed out that the nosebleed itself was only half the problem. He added that young Prince Kalyan had clearly been shedding weight at an alarming rate lately. It was plain to see on his frame. As the bleeding finally slowed, Kalyan knew there was no hiding the weight loss. Flashing a weak smile to try and calm everyone's nerves, Kalyan insisted he'd just been hitting the gym a little too hard. Deep down, though, Kalyan started to spiral. No matter how much effort he put in, his stamina was hitting rock bottom. Every time he tried to channel his mana, it felt like his body was being torn apart. Kalyan was convinced something was deathly wrong with his heart, but the irritated tailor snapped that this wasn't something to ignore, and demanded to know if he'd had a checkup. Kalyan shook his head, insisting it wasn't necessary. Still, he couldn't help but panic, wondering why on earth he had to have a nosebleed in front of everyone. The tailor tried to push the issue, but Kalyan stood his ground, claiming he was fine. That's when Zhang jumped in. He stated flatly that he couldn't sit by while things were like this, and then audaciously claimed the nosebleed was just because the prince had a bad habit of picking his nose. He carried on, saying it must have been awkward for the prince to admit such a personal, embarrassing habit to everyone. Kalyan stood there utterly stunned by the ridiculous lie his servant was spinning. As the vassals exchanged knowing whispers, Zhang drove the final nail in by declaring the prince was eating well and exercising perfectly. He insisted the nosebleed was strictly down to that nasty habit. The tailor bought it, figuring Zhang knew the prince better than anyone, and Zhang just shot Kalyan a sly, winking smile. Kalyan was left dazed and confused until he suddenly flashed back to the day when Jean had grilled him about his health and Kalyan had let slip that he could use magic. He realized his health issues were mana-related, and for a split second he panicked, wondering if Jean was trying to destroy his reputation. But he felt a wave of relief wash over him when he realized his servant had just handed him the perfect cover-up. To get them out of the hot seat, the tailor promised he would finish the clothing repairs as scheduled. He sounded a bit nervous about the tight deadline, but Zhang quickly reassured him that the prince had other appointments lined up first, which would give them plenty of breathing room. The tailor walked away, clearly relieved to have the time he needed, while Zhang leaned in close, whispering to the prince. The prince asked Baron, his voice barely a tremor, if the long-awaited day had finally arrived. Baron stayed silent, lost in his own head. Choking on his own anxiety about the future, he knew he had to track down the mage Elaine, regardless of her actual condition. If word of his failing health got out, it would spread through the palace like wildfire. So before the secret could leak, he had to hunt the mage down at any cost. By lunchtime, they made their way to the designated spot, only to be met with news that a sudden emergency had scrapped the lunch plans, and they'd be doing individual one-on-one meetings instead. The prince was blindsided by the sudden shift, wondering how on earth he'd find the time to see everyone. He turned to Baron, wondering if it wouldn't be way more efficient to just meet the whole group at once, but he kept his head down and followed the butler to the first room. Baron felt a flicker of nerves. He hadn't been expecting a private audience. The door creaked open. A voice commanded the prince to enter as his majesty was waiting. The prince stepped into the chamber. He spotted a man lounging on the sofa, buried in a newspaper. It was Roman, the king of Cyrus. The king of Cyrus didn't even look up, remaining fixated on his reading. The third prince bowed low to pay his respects, then slowly straightened up. He tried to lock eyes with the king, but something left him completely taken aback. The king showed zero regard for his presence, keeping his nose in the paper. Baron thought, even if he wasn't always a stickler Kairosian etiquette, he knew the king's behavior was flat-out rude. The king then gestured for him to sit. The king wished him a happy 30th birthday and asked after his health, his gaze still glued to the news. The king remarked that he looked to be doing well, which caught the prince off guard. The prince recalled all his vassals fretting over his health. He figured even the random staff knew that he had recovered quickly. The prince finally clicked on why the king wanted to see them one by one even, though he was short on time. If the king had met all three sons at once, he would have had to juggle the conversation. So one at a time made it easier for the king. Spending real time with his sons, who actually wanted to offer birthday wishes, was clearly a waste to him. Baron found the customs of this family bizarre. A father who couldn't care less about his kids, an eldest prince who ignored everything around him, and a second prince who had zero manners, reeked of booze, and treated his vassals like trash. As Baron wrapped up these thoughts, someone strode into the dining hall. The king, looking visibly annoyed, barked that she was late. It was the queen. With a mocking tone, she brushed it off as she walked in, with a sarcastic smirk. Baron concluded she held enough power to openly snub the king. The prince just flashed a smile, thinking to himself that there was someone among them who was actually plotting to kill him. As a vassal announced the start of the event at the top of his lungs, Baron tried to figure out who might be behind the assassination attempt. As the prince stepped out before the crowd, someone whispered to another, "He's a completely different person." By comparison, the second prince looked like a total drunk. The ones whispering were the king and queen. The queen figured it didn't change anything. The people were just making noise. Sipping his wine, the king noted that something felt different, unlike the past. Something had shifted. Then the third prince was announced, and he walked into the hall, grabbing every eye in the room. The crowd was absolutely stunned by the sight. So the rumors were true, the guests thought. The prince with the dark hair and striking red eyes looked just like Cistanien. The prince's new look turned every head, especially the way he'd trimmed the bangs that used to hide his face. He was also wearing a vibrant red brooch that made his eyes pop. It was a clear statement he wasn't hiding anymore. The prince beamed as he noticed everyone checking out his outfit. Then his servant Jean leaned in and whispered, asking why everyone was staring at him and his attire. Jean said he already knew the answer, and Prince Baron looked at him, waiting for the explanation with a radiant smile. The servant guessed it was because of his beauty, adding that he would certainly be happy to see him looking so sharp. Baron was caught off guard by Jean's comment. Baron explained that the stares were actually because of the jewelry he was wearing. He mentioned how hard the tailor worked on them. Baron advised Jean to be glad they'd only used a few because if he had worn all the pieces, the situation would have been much worse. Jean, however, insisted that the prince looked fantastic. As they walked down the hall, Baron asked if Jean's family lived in Kirissus, the capital of Kiris. Jean was surprised the prince even remembered that. The servant explained that his younger sister and father had moved back to their hometown, and only the rest of the family lived back in Kirissus. The prince then asked if he would come to the royal palace, and Jean replied that he would, provided he received an invitation. Baron paused and glanced at him, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, while Jan asked when they were supposed to leave Raven, who was waiting for them out in the garden. Baron realized that the servant wasn't keen on talking about his family. The prince figured there were things he preferred to keep quiet about, so Baron just answered Jan's question by declaring that they would simply wait for the right moment. The prince mentioned there was someone he wanted to see, which took his servant by surprise. Then Baron asked John if he knew why the hall was named Siegfried. The servant replied that yes, of course. It was named after the first patriarch and one of the great war heroes, the duke who traversed Hans Siegfried. The Siegfried ducal family, the only one standing in the light. Despite their immense power, they had remained loyal to the royal family for over 500 years, with unwavering dedication in the defense of the Cistanien territory. Baron remembered being deeply impressed when he first heard that story, back when he was in Baron. John then asked if by any chance the person the prince wanted to see. Before John could even finish his sentence, the answer revealed itself at that very moment. A loud laugh drew their attention. A man declared that the Siegfried lineage truly is a timeless classic. John then pointed to the prince, saying, "He's right there." It was Duke Slimmen Hans Siegfried, a very elegant man with a well-groomed beard, with long hair and a captivating smile. Baron felt a sense of satisfaction, as he had a soft spot for people from such loyal families. Prince Baron subtly began to release his magic, testing the Duke's perception, and Slimmen quickly picked up on the magical aura. In the vicinity, he turned his face directly toward the third prince, locking eyes with Baron. Slimmen remarked on the magic radiating from him. Baron thought, so that's how it feels to radiate magic. He was pleased. As expected, Slimmen had detected it instantly, even with so little power flowing. John then commented that the Duke seemed interested in the prince, and the prince knew that Slimmen was one of the 5 master swordsmen on the continent, so it was impossible for him not to notice. So Baron stated that it was still too early for that, and asked John to act as if he hadn't noticed Slimon's gaze, turning and moving away from the Duke's line of sight. Slimon watched them walk away, noticing that a peculiar energy seemed to be coming from the young prince. Shortly after, the king raised his glass to thank everyone for their presence and invited the guests to enjoy the evening in honor of Kiris. Meanwhile, Baron and Jan took advantage of a moment of distraction to slip out quietly through a window using a rope they had prepared. Then they headed to the garden where the horse, known for its disobedience, was waiting for the third prince. However, under Baron's command, the horse seemed calm and gentle, even earning praise from the prince and Jan. Nonetheless, warned Baron not to be fooled. But after watching the horse's behavior in Baron's presence, John admitted the animal was genuinely intelligent. The servant asked that they should head to the main gate, and the prince replied yes, because for the time being, no one was getting in without an invitation. As they approached the gate, they noticed a commotion among the guards and a visitor, who claimed to have traveled a long way. But despite that, a guard informed him that he could not enter and told him to leave. Baron observed the whole scene, and the prince was surprised when he recognized the visitor. The visitor asked the guard if the refusal of entry was due to the lack of an invitation. It was Hélène Manassil. All the guards were stunned to discover the identity of the man on horseback. They grew fearful and began whispering among themselves. Then, one of the guards insisted that even knowing who he was, there he was. He clearly needed an invitation, and Alan just smiled. Hidden under his hood, he looked at the guards and sneered. How pathetic. Judging a guest's status just by what they're wearing. Baron, who had been eavesdropping from a distance, was taken aback by the mage's cutting remark. Baron started thinking about how shallow it is to judge someone by their clothes. But then, he realized Alan wasn't just complaining for the sake of it. It seemed like the mage was using this as an excuse to avoid entering Kairos altogether. Without another word, Alan turned his horse around and announced he would be back soon. Baron watched the mage ride off, knowing he couldn't let this chance slip away. His attendant, as if reading his mind, warned him that the king's orders strictly forbade anyone from leaving during the festival. As he began to slowly pull away from Kiris, Baron realized that if he hesitated, he'd lose him for good. Baron ordered Jan to do whatever it took to stall the guards while he himself kicked his horse into a sprint toward the gate, leaving Jan behind, who was desperately shouting for his prince. Baron simply urged his horse to run faster. The guards at the gate commanded the prince to halt his horse immediately. They reminded him that leaving was strictly prohibited by royal decree. With impressive skill, the prince's horse vaulted over the soldiers, and he quickly vanished toward the horizon. The guards were stunned by the display and the sheer speed of the horse. Shouting at the top of their lungs, they alerted everyone that the prince had fled Kiris. They scrambled to grab their own horses to give chase. Yan, still completely bewildered, had no idea how to help the prince in such a mess. Then he remembered the prince's command, do the impossible to hold the guards back. Jan steeled himself, telling himself he was the valet to Prince Kallion, and it was his duty to protect him at any cost. In a sudden burst of bravery, he screamed at all the guards to stop right there. Yen declared that Duke Siegfried had personally authorized Kallion's departure. One of the guards snapped back, asking who. He thought he was to go around using the Duke's name like that. Then, letting his hair down, he revealed his true identity. Soroyan Siegfried. With his hair flowing in the wind, he declared himself the Duke's eldest son. A few moments later, the sound of someone having a great time echoed out in loud, boisterous laughter. Jan, or Soroyan, looked visibly mortified, while someone beside him was laughing uncontrollably. Soroyan, still flushing with embarrassment, muttered that there was nothing to be proud of. Then, a voice boomed out, drawing his father's attention. The Duke, still chuckling, said he couldn't believe his own son had actually pulled off something so clever. Playfully, like a father teasing a child, the Duke teased that his son was out chasing after a boy. He then added that it was actually a smart move on Jan's part, but Jan retorted that it wasn't because His Highness would only ruin the relationship between himself and the king. Jan's father. The Duke simply said he wasn't going to ask what happened. Jan was stunned by his father's calm reaction. The Duke repeated that he wouldn't pry into the details. Duke Siegfried began to weigh the consequences. If the prince accepts the Siegfried family's help, he'll be wary of our motives. if there's a dynamic where he receives support but faces no punishment, it's basically admitting a friendly alliance between our family and the prince. Brisson will definitely use this to attack us. It'll probably be swept under the rug anyway, Duke Siegfried concluded. Prince Baron was still hot on the heels of the mage Elan and was just about to catch up to him near a fountain. Elan sensed Baron's presence and remarked that it didn't seem like the prince was there just to nag him about missing his invitation. The mage questioned why Kirusa's third prince was tagging along with an old man. Baron recalled rumors that reaching the seventh, Prince Baron noted the late hour and asked if Elan would simply be heading back. Elan replied that when he tried to push open a sealed door, the threshold still felt far too steep for him. Baron couldn't grasp Elan's hidden meaning. Was it a hint or just talk? He only knew there was nothing he could do to assist the mage. Baron then countered that Elan had walked toward a locked door when another path had been laid out for him. He demanded to know where the mage had stashed. Locking eyes with Elan, Baron claimed he was blocking the wind himself and had neglected to sweep the dust from the doorway. He added that he hadn't anticipated the guard's blunder. The mage was stunned by Baron's bluntness, wondering if the prince was being genuine or just incredibly cheeky. Watching him, Elan remembered their first meeting. Baron's gaze, Elan spotted something unusual about the prince that grabbed his focus. He called out to Baron, who waited patiently before quickly excusing himself and grabbing Baron's hand to pull it closer. Caught off guard, Baron tried to ask what the mage was doing. But Elan was already channeling magic, probing for the dormant energy hidden deep within the prince's body. Pain spiked in Baron's heart instantly, the same agonizing sensation he felt whenever he tried to tap into his own magic. Elan's mana yet Baron's own mana shoved back with violent force, triggering a shockwave that blasted them apart. Their horses panicked and scrambled back. As the sharp ache in his chest lingered, Elan murmured, "Even when doors are bolted shut, the wind cannot be entirely contained." Baron realized the mage had already seen through. Baron conceded that the mage was partially right, as he himself was He questioned if the prince really was oblivious to the source of his condition. Studying Baron's stance, the mage connected the dots. If he doesn't realize the real issue lies elsewhere, then Elan glared at Baron, his fist tightening. The Kairo family treated mages with open contempt, despite their own dragon blood lineage. The great mage, yet he now found himself with a young, still catching his breath from the chaotic turn of events. Baron began to speak. He knew the mage would sniff out any lie, so he chose to be completely honest. Baron dismounted, and stepping slowly toward the mage, asked for his name. The prince realized he truly believed his life was hanging by a thread. Observing the prince, Elan thought, "It's not that I'm unaware of the third prince's situation." Suddenly a spell crackled around them. Baron was startled by the sheer speed as Elan leapt off his horse with agile grace. Baron wondered if it had been a silent incantation. Still reeling from the mage's ability to cast without a single spoken word, Elan challenged the prince. "What is your goal? Are you just trying to prevent what's coming?" Elan pushed further. "Or are you trying to cut out the root of the problem?" The prince replied that for now, he was only trying to prevent it from happening. Elan was taken aback by the young man's answer. Baron pressed on, declaring that he truly intended to eliminate the source of the problem, once and for all. Repeating the mage's words, he questioned, "The wind cannot be blocked." Baron admitted the mage was right, to a certain extent because he himself couldn't use mana. Elan, lost in his own thoughts, wondered if the mana wasn't the issue at all, and questioned if the prince was truly blind to the cause of his own disability. Watching Baron closely, the mage reached a chilling conclusion. If he doesn't know the real trouble lies elsewhere, then... Elan stared at Baron, his knuckles white. The Kairo line treated mages with such disdain, even though they supposedly carry the blood of dragons. The great mage Elan had come of his own volition, with the intent to deceive them. Yet he now found himself crossing paths with this young prince, wandering toward an uncertain fate. Elan finally asked why the prince wanted to see him so badly. Baron, still reeling from the rapid pace of their encounter, began to speak. Knowing the mage would spot any deception, he decided to level with him. Baron climbed down from his horse, and walking slowly toward the mage, asked for his name. The prince concluded that he honestly believed his life was about to reach its end. Elan, watching the prince speak, thought, It isn't that I don't know the third prince's position. He is hated by all, a prince boxed in by enemies. Suddenly a spell flared around them, shocking Baron with its speed, while Elan slipped off his horse with cat-like grace. Baron wondered if it had been a silent spell, still awestruck by the mage's ability to conjure without uttering a single syllable. Elan then demanded to know the prince's true objective. "Do you just want to stop the outcome?" Elan asked. "Or are you trying to destroy the true cause?" He repeated the question. The prince answered that for the time being, he was only trying to stop it from happening. Elan was stunned by the young man's response. Baron continued, vowing that he really did want to eradicate the root of the trouble. He wrapped up his answer by saying that if he had to take the throne to reach his goal, he'd do it with a cynical smirk. Helena thought the throne was just a stepping stone for the prince, especially since the prince himself was fading away. "The prince who looks like Sisian needs my help to achieve his goal," Elan concluded. The mage found the whole thing fascinating and couldn't hide his excitement. He then asked the prince to show him what kind of formal invitation he was offering. Without a second thought, the prince dropped to one knee before the mage. He introduced himself by his full name, Kalian Rain Karis, and paid his respects to his mentor. Elin Menazil accepted the young highness's offer. Watching the young prince kneeling there, Helena couldn't help but feel he would be her lifeline. The scene shifted to Jean talking with his father, questioning if he was absolutely sure that people didn't know who he really was. The Duke replied that he had already handled it and that Jean had nothing to worry about. Jean countered that if his identity had been exposed, he wouldn't be able to stay there. While the Duke kept talking about Jean's background, a sudden thought struck the young man. Looking a bit troubled, he started asking about a certain Leah. His inquiry about her well-being grabbed his father's attention, making him stop mid-sentence. The Duke replied that Leah was doing just fine running the family branch, a role Jean had walked away from. The Duke stood up, stretched, and told Jean he was welcome back any time. With a sigh, he added that he didn't expect to see him for quite a while. Jean, head bowed, asked what he meant since they were going to see each other in 3 months. Duke Siegfried, stunned by his son's words, wondered if Jean was truly planning to give up his position as the prince's servant. Jean, for his part, remained deep in thought, head still lowered. He replied that he would be turning 15 soon. The Duke was caught off guard by the answer and simply watched him in silence. Then the Duke studied his son intently and asked if Jean was familiar with the nickname of the Siegfried family. Jean confirmed it before his father could even finish. His father smiled and confirmed he was right. The Duke revealed, "We are the Lions of Karis." For a long time, they had never vied for the throne, yet everyone knew of their immense power. They are known as the kings of beasts, untouchable, even by the most dangerous predators. As the Duke stared off thoughtfully, Jean started to ask why his father brought this up so suddenly, but he was cut off. His father pulled him into a tight embrace, telling him that the name he carried held great weight. Still holding his son, the Duke told Jean to do whatever his heart desired. Jean gripped his father's arm, overflowing with happiness at the words he had just heard. Then his father playfully started to put him in a headlock, calling him a brat for worrying him so much. Jean told him to quit it, because it was actually hurting. Father and son continued to share a laugh together on that beautiful night. Jean pulled himself together ready to step back into his role as a servant and addressed his father as Duke Siegfried. The Duke chided him for the formal tone and told him to get lost already. Jean bowed deeply to his father and said he'd see him next time. The Duke just watched him walk away. Sitting on the bench, the Duke remarked that Jean's fiery spirit only confirmed that he was truly a real Siegfried. Then, the Duke recalled the moments in the hall when the prince radiated such intense magic, and wondered when exactly the prince had grown so much. Staring up at the night sky, under the glow of a full moon, the Duke couldn't help but wonder what the prince was really planning. The day broke beautifully, with a sky as blue as the sea and scattered clouds, while a group of horses drew near. A carriage pulled up, and the onlookers could hardly believe their eyes, wondering if that crest was really what they thought it was. The emblem displayed 7 red flowers and a silver cane. A lady mentioned to a man that she'd heard Elon Manassel's contract with the Reverend had come to an end. The man then asked how Elon was doing in Kiris. Isn't it obvious, considering what he had been through? Like that. The woman asked, saying if it weren't for the king, he would have left already. The woman asked if it was because of the rumor she had heard earlier. The man in turn wondered if it were true that Helena Manasil's son, while he kept speaking. Someone stepped out of the carriage. It was Ilan Manasil, sporting a sharp black and white outfit with his hair flowing loose. He hopped out with a grin, fully expecting his new apprentice to have something thoughtful waiting for him. He recalled the young prince's request to arrive at exactly 9:30. He had also been told to just head through the open gate. Ilan couldn't help but wonder if His Highness was trying to play games with the prison family, if that was the play things were about to get complicated. The Baron was biding his time, waiting to introduce the mage to the noble and stir up the political pot. Then a man approached, clearly taken aback by the mage Manasil's sudden appearance. A group of vassals quickly filled him in, letting him know that His Highness was expecting the mage's arrival. While sharing tea with an attendant, the king started questioning what he'd been told. The king sat there sipping tea with the mage. The king pressed him, since the mage had requested living quarters. The king asked again, to be certain if the mage really wanted a place to stay in Kiris. The mage replied, with total composure, that yes, he truly needed a place to stay in Kiris. The king then pondered the mage's abrupt request to go head-to-head with Selik. The king figured he would need power like Ilan Manasil's on his side. However, the king didn't expect the mage to be the one dealing with trouble first. The king tried to figure out what Ilan might be plotting. While nursing his tea, Ilan offhandedly mentioned that last night in the town square. Ilan remarked that last night at the square, he had spotted a black cat with piercing red eyes. The king, looking a bit confused, listened on. The mage continued, explaining that the cat was unusually bright, and he was thinking of taking it on as a student. But the creature had nowhere to crash, which caught the king off guard. The king asked what exactly Ilan intended to teach the cat. Ilan replied that obviously he wanted to teach the cat magic, and not just that, he also wanted to set up a space the cat would enjoy so he could get his project off the ground. Ilan would need to assist the owner of the house while sorting out his own residence. The king was floored, as Ilan seemed to have eyes on everything happening behind the scenes. The king then asked if Ilan could handle it all. Ilan knew that by taking on Kalyan as a disciple, the prison couldn't stop him, and that would allow him to help the prince without any interference. He told the king that all these thoughts were actually sparked by an invitation from Prince Kalyan. The king slapped his hand against his leg, stood up abruptly, and declared he would provide a place for the prince to stay. A smile tugging at his lips, Ilan thought to himself that the situation was already a disaster, and it couldn't get any worse. The king then mentioned he was curious about something. He'd heard rumors that the boy wasn't anything special. Ilan questioned the not special part, thinking to himself that even Kalyan's health condition was uniquely, annoyingly special. It had reached a point where finding anything normal about the prince was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The king went on saying he'd heard the boy had plenty of phobias, especially regarding horses. Yet, Ilan was still pursuing him. The mage was surprised. The king only repeated gossip he'd picked up from others. The king added that if Kalyan had been something special, he surely would have heard about it. Ilan cut the king off to throw a question back at him. Perhaps you don't even know the prince's actual condition, the mage asked. He kept wondering if the king had any idea how important the princes really were. The king stared at the mage, his expression turning grave. The mage had his answer. The king didn't know a thing about his own sons. Ilan remarked that sometimes. Too much attention can be a poison, while a little distance can be a cure. But he knew full well that being too busy was just a tired excuse, the mage concluded. The king was stunned by what he'd just heard, and by the mage's sheer audacity. He said he would treat Ilan's overstepping as nothing more than the concern of Kalyan's teacher. As he headed for the door, the king claimed it was ridiculous to have to justify himself, but insisted he cared deeply for his princes, especially Kalyan, who was precious to him. He finished speaking while gripping the doorknob. The king started to say it was time to end this conversation right here. But before he could even finish, Ilan snapped his fingers. Suddenly, a silencing spell was cast around them, making the king jump in surprise. Elaine grabbed the king's attention, snapping at him to stop dragging his feet. The king shot back, demanding to know what Elan was actually doing, and just how he dared to weave magic right inside the royal palace. Elan began breaking down the grim reality of Kalion's condition. His lips were bone dry, and he was gasping for air. His skin had taken on a sickly blue tint, and his fingernails were a haunting shade of purple. Underneath it all, his clothes had clearly been thrown on in a desperate rush, and, considering they'd been tailored, a month ago, Kalion must have wasted away to nothing. He tried to push himself up, but his body just wouldn't obey. With eyes squeezed shut, he felt the world spinning. The king was visibly shaken by the cold, hard truths Elaine was laying out. Elaine pressed on warning him that if he just stood by as a spectator, he would lose everything. A servant approached John, who was standing guard outside the prince's chambers. The servant mentioned it was nearly lunchtime, and the prince hadn't touched his morning tea yet. So Jan grabbed the tray, promising to keep a close eye on him, just in case the prince started coughing. He stepped inside and found the prince still buried in his blankets. He looked shattered, and honestly, dangerously thin. Jan couldn't help but think the last day had been pure hell for the prince. Just as Jan moved to wake the prince, Elaine materialized behind him, casually asking if the prince was still dead to the world. Jan jumped out of his skin, barely processing the mage's presence at first. A split second later, he panicked, sent the tea tray flying, and started scolding the mage for popping up out of thin air. In a fit of nerves, he demanded to know how someone like Master Elaine could just pull a stunt like that. Elaine retorted, pointing out that outsiders weren't allowed in the palace, so he had to teleport, since he lacked permission. Jan blinked. The mage brushed it off, claiming this was a minor breach compared to the real issue, and that he was just a master of his craft. Jan tried to regain his composure, telling Elaine to beat it since the prince's health was hanging by a thread. Before the words were even out, Elaine stepped into Jan's space, asking if he really didn't recognize him. Elaine reminded him that Jan had been to Reberine a few years back. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize you just because you've grown up?" Elaine teased. He even called him baby elephant, which left Jan completely floored. Jan recalled his father, swearing that no one would ever suspect his true identity. Looking absolutely stunned, Jan felt exposed, and for a fleeting moment, the color drained from his face. Prince Baran stirred, snapping them out of the tension. He asked how long he'd been under. Before answering, Jan informed the prince he had a visitor. The prince sat up, asking who it was. Seeing Elaine in his room, his eyes lit up, and he called him Professor. Elaine then handed the prince a small red pouch with something tucked inside. Prince Baran fumbled with the knot to open it, and asked what on earth this was. Baran tipped a few small pellets into his palm, while Elaine insisted he take one every single day, without fail. Baran questioned if it was some kind of medicine. Elaine explained that the prince was currently fighting 2 uphill battles. The first was his inability to control his mana, and the second was the alarming rate at which he was shedding weight. Prince Baran remarked that even without him saying a word, Elaine seemed to see right through everything. Elaine asked if Baran still held the power of the blessing. The prince confirmed it, explaining that the gift usually granted regenerative healing and a natural affinity for magic. Baran sighed, noting that while that was true, even that healing power had simply vanished. Thinking back to when he'd injured his hand, he asked Elaine if perhaps there was something fundamentally broken in his heart. Elaine leaned in, asking pointedly if Baran had ever considered that it might be a strange, forced combination. That left the prince deep in thought. Baran mused that he'd always wondered if the power of the blessing was fortifying his heart, since that was the source of his mana and his very life. Elaine validated the prince's hunch, confirming that the blessing did in fact strengthen the heart. With a sharp, serious look, Elaine declared that Baran's blessing hadn't disappeared, his heart hadn't failed, and his mana hadn't been blocked. The prince leaned in, desperate to know what was actually happening. Elaine shot him a look. Hadn't he ever wondered if the blessing of Sistania hadn't vanished, but was being drained to its absolute breaking point somewhere else? Elaine asked. The young prince was paralyzed by the revelation, realizing the blessing was being siphoned off until he was left with nothing. Healing minor wounds. Panicked Baron asked Helene if there could still be poison lingering in his system. "Without my blessing, you would have been dead already," the mage replied, clearly shaken. The prince only had ears for Helene. He explained that purging such lethal toxins put an incredible strain on the body, and his healing powers were reaching their absolute limit. To make matters worse, Baron had tried to channel mana in that weakened state. Because of that, his heart had outright rejected the flow of energy. Baron began to process the reality of this body. Originally, Kalyan was destined to be assassinated, but he had already been poisoned, long before Baran took over this vessel. It wasn't some last-minute plot. Just before the deed was done, Baron seethed with rage. Why target a child who was already on the verge of death? Helene sensed the cold fury radiating from the young prince. She thought to herself, this isn't the kind of bloodlust a 14-year-old boy should ever possess. Just what is he really? Oh, Helene wondered as the mage finished his train of thought. Baran decided the antidote was the answer. He grabbed one of the pills from the small pouch. The sorcerer confirmed it had been whipped up in a rush, but was confident it would do the trick. As Baran inspected the pill, he shot a cryptic look at Helene and asked, "What if I chose to use both at the same time?" He held up his hand to display the pill. Helene was completely caught off guard by the young prince's question. He cautioned that even if the antidote worked, ingesting the poison simultaneously would only delay the inevitable. Baran remarked that would be enough. Stunned by the reply, Helene wondered if Baran was actually crazy enough to take both, and if he already knew who the culprit was. Baran claimed he already had a hunch. He explained that he believed the source of the poisoning was the tea he drank every morning since he consumed it in front of everyone, and no one else dared to share it with him. Did Kalyan realize what was happening to his body and stop drinking the tea? Maybe that's why they finished him off, Baran mused. Baran knew the game had changed the moment he took over this body. He wasn't sure anymore which method the assassin might use next to take him out. He told Helene that until he figured out the method, he had to keep everything under wraps. The sorcerer wondered if that was truly the only reason. Baran explained that if he revealed that the morning tea was the problem, Jan and the other loyal vassals would be put in danger, and he couldn't allow that. The prince stated that the culprit had been operating with total regularity, clearly convinced they wouldn't be caught. Sighing, Helene assured him the baby elephant would be fine. Baran didn't get the reference, but the sorcerer just told him to let it slide. Regardless, the sorcerer insisted he understood Baran's predicament, then asked, "What's your next move?" In his memories, Baran recalled a man who called him a fool and told him that to claim another person's soul, you first had to offer something in return. In those moments, he thought, that's when I remember your father. Then, Baran asked Helene to help him slip out of the palace the following morning. The next morning kicked off with shouting. Someone was calling for the prince, demanding he wake up immediately. The door flew open, and a figure barged into the prince's chambers. The servants who were desperately trying to stir the prince were brushed aside instantly by the intruder. She yanked the curtains off the bed with a violent motion. It was the queen who demanded, "It is already far too late to prepare for your afternoon obligations. Don't you think?" The prince sat up in bed shirtless, wearing a weary expression. The queen was taken aback by the sharp scent of alcohol that hit her. She demanded to know if he hadn't managed to pull himself together, even after being forbidden from drinking, following the ceremony in the square. Calm down. The prince picked up the glass of water by his bed and asked why she was there. He simply told her to give her answer and get out, which irritated the queen so much she bit her lip in frustration. She informed him that Kalyan had apparently decided to take on a mentor, the 7th Circle mage, Aline Manasil. As Planche finished his water, she added that the aristocrats were already hesitant, showing absolutely no interest. The second prince demanded to know what that had to do with him. The queen stepped toward Planche abruptly and glared at him, pure fury in her eyes. Warning him not to waste all the resources they'd poured into him, she ordered him to get ready. "Right now, countless eyes will be watching you today," the queen told Planche. "So you'd better not disappoint me," she snapped, storming out of the prince's chambers. Planche was absolutely livid. He hurled the glass he was holding against the floor, leaving his vassals startled. They noticed he was bleeding. Droplets of blood hit the floor, and Planche bellowed at them to leave, screaming in a fit of rage. He ordered everyone to get out immediately. Inside his mind, The smiling face of Kalyan with those piercing red eyes flashed before him. The second prince was consumed by his own fury. The royal family paraded through the kingdom. While the king was showered with cheers, he waved back to the adoring crowd. Inside the carriage, the queen simply watched the euphoric masses. Right behind them came the three elegant princes on their horses. A child perched on his father's shoulders was delighted to see them all. The father pointed out that the one riding in the very back was the one he wanted to see most. It was Prince Kalyan, dressed in his signature red, which only made his eyes look even more striking. Kalyan's servant, who was leading his horse, called out to him looking troubled. He was genuinely concerned about the prince's health. That day the servant expressed his relief to see the prince looking much better than the day before. The prince, a faint smile on his lips, replied that it was because he'd finally gotten some rest. He figured it must have been the antidote he took. The day before, and the heartache he'd been suffering had eased up significantly. The servant mentioned the packed schedule. For the day, a parade, a horse ride, and then a ball. Kalyan just replied that the servant was worrying too much. He insisted he was feeling better and could handle all the commitments without any trouble. Suddenly, a man in a hooded cloak was spotted hiding in the middle of the crowd. He was tucked away in an alley. The prince watched the man, and something about him grabbed his attention. The prince tried to place these people as he had never seen them before. He recalled the war he had witnessed, and the man who had saved his life during that conflict. It was the same man standing in the alley right in front of him. The prince was stunned, wondering if it was truly Kairo. Then he became certain it was him. His horse Baron also noticed Kairo's presence, and the prince couldn't help but wonder what Kairo was doing in Karis. The horse tried to move toward Kairo, but the prince's servant held the reins tight, stopping him from leaving the procession. The prince then ordered them to keep moving, while the hooded figures turned away to leave. The servant wondered if there was something important going on. Baron just kept watching the men as they walked away. The prince stroked his horse to calm him down, a small smile on his face as he whispered, "You sensed it too, didn't you? But we can't go after them now," he concluded as the men vanished from his sight. Kalyan then drifted back to his past, to the day he died. He remembered the smile on Kairo's face as he sacrificed everything to save his life. As the royal family paraded down the red carpet, a man stepped forward to greet them. It was Melfir Paloon, the shop owner, who had organized an equestrian show in honor of the royal family. Kalyan thought this had nothing to do with him, since it was thanks to this very event that he'd been dragged into a pointless war of nerves. He remembered that Prince Randall had been injured, and Baron Paloon had been hanged that same day, during that very equestrian show. Meanwhile, Paloon, all smiles, was showing the royal family the way as they arrived. He led them to the seats he had specially prepared. As he observed his surroundings, the prince noticed the chandelier. He remembered that this was the very one that would fall on Prince Randall. Kalyan found it bizarre that the guards hadn't checked something so vital, especially with the king and the royal knights present. Speaking of knights, he remembered that annoying commander. With a faint smirk, Kalyan stood there, lost in thought, as Paulon led the way. He wondered, was he really going to give this guy a shot at survival? The prince knew someone like Paulon would jump at the chance to win over the king. The servant told Kalyan to holler if he needed anything at all. Kalyan simply muttered that he wasn't feeling well. Comfortable with the massive chandeliers hanging overhead, he turned his back, walked away, and ordered Paulon to go take a closer look at them. Paulon was completely taken aback by the prince's request. Still, he went over to inspect the chandelier, having no clue what the point was. Down below, the equestrian show kicked off. Horses and their master riders began putting on a wild display of acrobatics. Someone was standing there with hands clasped, trembling with anticipation, daydreaming that one day all this glory would be his. It was Paulon, absolutely buzzing with excitement to be so close to His Majesty. He'd prepared for this moment for so long, he couldn't let it slip through his fingers. Then, something behind him caught his eye. It was Prince Kalyan. Getting a bit bored with the show, Paulon remembered the prince's request and went to check the cables. With the ropes in his hands, Paulon was stunned by what he found. The cable was in a pathetic state. It was practically ready to snap. He shuddered, thinking about what would have gone down if the prince hadn't tipped him off. If that thing had dropped, Paulon's fate would have been sealed right then and there. Watching the prince from afar, Paulin couldn't help but wonder, how on earth did he even know about the rigging in the first place? Paulin figured the prince must be sharp enough to read the room and always pick the best move for his own gain. Still, he kept asking himself, what exactly made the Baron such a dangerous enemy in the prince's eyes? Then Paulin caught sight of the second prince. He was shocked to see Planche staring him down without blinking. Meanwhile, Prince Planche was just eyeing Paulin with that usual cold look of his. Planche snapped at Paulin to know his place, calling him nothing more than a bug. Just then, the announcer kept the show rolling, with high energy. Up in the royal box, though, the vibe was about to get ugly. Planche sneered that the stench of Callion's mother's filthy blood made him sick. Everyone nearby heard Planche's words, and they were absolutely floored. It even grabbed the attention of the king, who usually couldn't care less about whatever his princes were arguing about. Prince Callion looked visibly shaken by Planche's outburst, but in reality a wicked grin played on his lips, because Planche had picked the absolute worst time to run his mouth. Callion never expected Planche to be this useful. The king just stared straight ahead, leaving Queen Celeste to handle the mess and see how she'd smooth it over. Hiding behind her fan, the queen was a nervous wreck, thinking she had already warned Planche about this. She shot a death glare at Planche, but the prince didn't even flinch. That caught the queen off guard, and she wondered if Planche had done it on purpose. Why today of all days? She kept searching for an answer. Whispers spread like wildfire that Planche had spouted such trash right in front of the king. People were getting restless. They couldn't openly back Planche anymore, especially now that Callion had secured the mage's loyalty. It was starting to look like Callion might be the next one in line for the throne. The people knew they couldn't sit on the fence forever. The time to pick a side was drawing near. The show wrapped up without any real disaster. Callion had dodged a bullet, and the king didn't even scold Planche for his arrogance and his total lack of respect. Callion figured things were definitely starting to swing his way, but it felt too quiet, especially since his own plan had been completely blown out of the water. As Callion watched the queen, he wondered if she was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Memories from his past life flooded his mind. A man asked him what he made of the accident Callion had just narrowly avoided. The Baron then claimed it was likely an attempt to take out one of the three princes. What other reason could there be? He asked, but the man didn't answer. That man was Callion's brother, whom he challenged to a bet. The Baron remarked that he'd already lost a bunch of times and couldn't even keep track of how much he owed while they played chess. Callion's brother gave him a hint. He asked if the Baron didn't think the whole accident felt a little too staged. It was almost as if they were announcing that the royal family was the target. The Melfier Merchant Guild was the second largest in Kiris. For Renaud Romain, the master of the kingdom's primary merchant guild, this was a golden opportunity. It would be incredibly profitable to wipe Melfier off the board. Prince Callion asked his servant about the most vital asset of the Polu Merchant Guild. Jan replied that they were famous for their mine, a diamond mine. Callion finally had his answer. Once Pauline was cast aside, they could swoop in and claim their place, and seize control of the diamond trade. Prince Callion had originally planned to retreat after saving Pauline's life, but now he was going to make Pauline pay dearly for all the trouble she'd caused him. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Pauline was trembling with pure fear. She abruptly ordered her servant to clear her entire schedule for the rest of the day. The servant was stunned, as Pauline couldn't possibly miss the grand ball. She faked the look of shock at Pauline's audacity, forcing her servant to obey, and insisted that was the only reason why she wouldn't be attending today's appointments. Back at the palace, vassals were scrambling to tidy everything up, preparing for the ongoing festivities. The king, sitting alone in his chambers, looked deeply troubled. He was unsettled, lost in thought about everything that had unfolded. Then he remembered the mage's ominous words, that if he kept heading down this path, Callion would only be the first of many losses, that he would suffer. Pauline's words also echoed in his mind, that he felt nothing but disgust whenever he smelled the tainted blood of Callion's mother. A flood of memories rushed back. Now he saw a redhead calling out his name. It was Callion's mother, the king's former wife. She was on her deathbed. Suddenly, someone burst into the king's chambers, startling him. The vassal announced that the queen had demanded an immediate audience. Before he could respond, the queen swept into the room, heading straight for him. One of the servants, mid-pour, offered to prepare tea for her ladyship. The queen wondered if the king was hosting a guest, as she hadn't been informed. The king waved his hand, dismissing the servant and the tea. He added that the queen wouldn't be staying long, which clearly irked her. King Romain then demanded to know the reason for Celeste's visit. As she sat down, Celeste declared that the Romain house would take full responsibility for the incident. It was shocking to see her humble herself like this for Pauline's blunder. She had clearly decided to prioritize her son's reputation above all else. The king thoughtfully touched his chin, skeptical of her sincerity. Had she truly lost all her insolence? Responding to the king, Celeste noted that the day's parade had been quite impressive. She asked if Baron Palone didn't deserve a reward for organizing such a charming event. The king replied that she seemed to have put a lot of thought into this. Then Celeste snapped open her fan. Concealing her face, she declared her intention to grant him the exclusive supply rights for all goods required by the royal stables. She finished with a coy smile. The king was stunned, wondering if she was really willing to abandon such a lucrative investment. He then recalled his conversation with Manasseh, who had warned him that the queen knew. She had to concede something to mitigate the damage. However, she wasn't desperate enough yet to pull back the knights she had stationed throughout the palace. The mage continued explaining she would craft a proposal that she viewed as a fair trade. Once she does show her that your majesty is prepared to turn a blind eye, the mage concluded. With that in mind, the king crossed his legs, looking much calmer, and declared, "Pauline and I will enter the ballroom together tonight." This left the queen genuinely surprised, yet delighted. With a smile, she said he would be very pleased by this gesture. True to the agreement, Romain and Pauline entered the ballroom side by side, and Baron Palone was officially named the supplier for the royal stables. Everyone knew this was the result of Celeste's scheme to secure her son's reputation. It was unthinkable for the Romain house to suffer such a crushing blow. The queen was paying the price for Blanche's blunder, which meant Calian had become a threat they couldn't ignore. They needed to pressure the queen into taking action. In Calian's chambers, he and his attendant Jan are confronted by a mountain of gifts. Looking over them, Calian remarked that people certainly didn't hesitate to jump ship, while his attendant asked what to do with all the offerings. The prince was just pleased to see Blanche and the Romain family losing their grip on power. Calian replied that he intended to stop his hierarchy from being overrun by merchants. He ordered them to return every single gift, except for those from the Arcane Enclave and Paloon. As he walked out of his quarters, he told them not to forget to make a list of who sent what. Before leaving, Calian noticed a gift that caught his eye, a massive ornate collar dripping with jewels. It was incredibly flashy, studded with vibrant red gemstones. The sight baffled not just the prince, but every vassal standing in the room. Then, Calian asked if it was a horse collar. He noted how specific it was, and asked if Jan had heard anything. Jan replied that he only mentioned the young man's fondness for Raven, so this was completely unexpected. Calian wondered a piece of jewelry for a horse, but nothing for the master. He suspected he was being tested. Accepting this would mean letting the sender settle a life debt. The sender would then send another treasure for the prince, effectively considering the favor fully repaid. Then the young man with a smirk thought that wouldn't happen so easily. He wasn't settling for just a piece of jewelry. Calian told his attendant to find out the price of the collar and send the money to Paloon. When asked if he was buying it, the prince said no, because it was one of a kind, while pointing at a carnivorous plant. Calian declared that the price of originality was all he cared about. Jan picked up the gift to check the sender. It was from the Arcana Enclave. The surprised prince exclaimed, "Sorcerers and their sense of aesthetics." As Calian grabbed a note to read, his attendant mentioned it was quite rare and came with instructions. It was a magical flower that released bioluminescent pollen after it died, popular among herbalists in the early days. The prince didn't seem to grasp the reason for the gift at first, but then something clicked in his mind. He smiled, as if he had figured it all out. His attendant asked if he should send it back to the Enclave. The prince replied, "No, I'll keep it." While the maid was tidying his room, the young man seemed to have an idea. Suddenly, Calian's shout drew the maid's attention, freezing her in the background. Jan asked if everything was all right, and the prince replied that yes, it had just slipped from his hands. His teacup had fallen, spilling everything across the floor. Jan told one of the maids to clean up the mess. As she scrubbed near the prince's belongings, he noticed the tea had soaked the flower the plant was, partially covered in the liquid. While the maid was busy, Jan asked if the tea would harm the plant. The prince answered loud and clear, "No, because the tea isn't poisoned." The prince's words took the maid by surprise. He then told them to leave the flower pot exactly where it was, because he liked it quite a lot. Two men rode on horseback. One thanked the other for making time despite his busy schedule. They were the prince and the mage. The mage said he couldn't refuse, especially since the young man was risking his life. The mage commented that the prince seemed much happier outside than cooped up in the palace. The prince agreed, and he was about to say it was his first time, but he corrected himself, stating that he was just looking to have some fun. He had to remember he was Kalian, not Baron anymore. He asked the mage if he had actually received His Majesty's permission for this little excursion. The mage replied that His Majesty would be receiving the request at this very moment. Baron wasn't surprised by the mage's attitude, declaring that he felt just as guilty as the mage did. He recalled how he had slipped away from Ian to meet up with the mage, who told him right then and there that the prince was his apprentice. The prince chuckled, saying he'd take that as a compliment. Menezil asked if he was keeping up with the antidote. Baron looked the mage dead in the eye, his expression turning serious. He confirmed it, adding that he'd taken a dose earlier that day and was feeling much better. In fact, he was feeling so sharp that the poisoner was starting to panic. Everything was falling right into place. Once he walks into the trap, the prince concluded. The mage couldn't help but admire his ingenuity, hinting that maybe the prince never really needed him at all. The prince shook his head, insisting that wasn't true. With a sly smile, he declared that nothing could have been accomplished without the intriguing gift the mage had sent him. Reaching a certain point in the kingdom, they brought their horses to a halt. The mage turned his horse around, heading in the opposite direction from the prince. He said he'd go that far, leaving the rest to him. The mage felt he should probably look after his apprentice, but decided to let him do his own thing. Pulling his hood low, the prince said he knew the mage understood. Menezil mentioned there was a magic shop on Tyninja Street and told the prince to meet him there once he was finished with his business. Spurs digging into his horse, the prince promised to see him there and wished them both luck. They both rode off in different directions. Soon after, a rugged man was seen forging a blade. The prince held the sword, lifting it to his face, as the steel caught the reflection of his crimson eye. Riding away, he figured this would do for now. He sheathed the blade, confident he could handle things, until his custom order was ready. Near the mouth of a dark alleyway, just past the forge, he thought to himself that to get out of this, he needed intel. This Christian character ran a network that spanned the entire continent. It was built to gather information from other nations. But his spies did more than just collect secrets. Every single agent went through years of grueling training to become an elite assassin. And the people who built this network of killers were none other than the King of Aboyan, the Baron's father, the prince's former self. He pulled his hood tight to hide his face. As he crept down the dim alley, he spotted two men who looked drunk. He was already close to the Pigeon Post Center. Over on Naracha Street, Baron knew exactly how lethal these assassins were. After all, he was the one who had trained them. As the drunks stumbled past, the prince just tugged his hood lower, making sure he wouldn't be recognized. Being a prince now brought a whole new set of worries. If the assassins spotted him, they'd probably snatch him up. Or do something even worse. With his jet black hair and blood-red eyes, he was far too easy to spot. Baron knew he had to keep a low profile. He stepped into the Pigeon Post Center. It was a sprawling space, 2 stories high, and filled with birds. Walking inside, he realized it was much bigger than he'd imagined. A young guy who looked like an employee asked him if he was looking to buy a carrier pigeon. The prince said no. Baron remarked that the birds hadn't even woken up yet. That caught the attendant's attention. The man explained that the birds were just sleeping. The prince noted they must have flown a long way, since they looked completely exhausted. The man confirmed that was exactly why they were resting. Spotting a bird with a key-shaped mark on its back, Baron commented that this must be the bird's roosting spot. The man narrowed his eyes and asked what he was really doing there. Baron replied instantly that he was just looking for bird feed. The man said he'd come to the right place, but in a blink of an eye, the prince found himself under attack by the attendant. A blade sliced right through his hood. With a dagger pressed against the back of Baron's neck, the man growled that he didn't remember selling any pigeons today. Lately, Baron had a gut feeling that this guy wasn't just some random fighter, and that Kylan's body wasn't exactly ready to throw down with him. The prince calmly reached out, pressed the man's dagger down, and noted it was obvious he hadn't sold any birds, since Baron had only just arrived in this kingdom. The man just watched him, his gaze cool and unshaken. You see, around here, birds meant spies, and bird seed was code for intelligence. Everything was calm and quiet. Over there, the birds were actually spies, and the bird seed was just a way to trade secrets. Socrates' spies were trained to keep their identity locked down, even from their own allies, just to make sure their mission didn't go south. When the man asked who he was spying for, the prince flashed a half smile, showing he wasn't rattled. He knew there was no way for the guy to know, even though he'd been using his father Nobilidai's name to pose as a spy for the Surrections. Baron coolly replied that he was one of Nobilidai's spies. The man looked genuinely stunned by the reveal. This was the daughter of Kalyan, the first Syrian prince in history to actually spy on his own kingdom. Baron kept his cool. He said that if that was settled, he'd like his intel now, since he'd literally just left the nest. The man then triggered a secret passage to open. He told the prince to follow him. As he led the way, Baron kept his eyes sharp, scanning every inch of the tunnel. The guy mentioned they'd be seeing a lot of each other, and told Baron to call him White Falcon. The prince shot back that he could just call him Red Swan. The man chuckled, promising to remember that name. They reached a room packed with ancient books, and the man asked what he was looking for. Baron told him he needed a specific item and some information. The man coolly informed him that would run him 8 furains. He insisted on payment up front, which caught the prince off guard. Baron figured the guy didn't even know what kind of info he was after yet, and wondered if he was just trying to mess with him. The man answered before he could even ask, saying he charged a fee just for the inevitable questions. He handed over the item and the intel. Baron grabbed the paper, cracked it open, and started reading, asking if White Falcon was actually sure this was the right place. White Falcon stood by his word, claiming it was the only place that could fulfill such a request. The prince thanked him for the help. As Baron turned to leave, the man told him to watch his back. That caught Baron's attention. The guy didn't strike him as the type to care about anyone's well-being. The Falcon simply noted that it wasn't exactly the safest neighborhood. As the prince stepped through the door, he had to agree considering all the hidden dangers lurking around. I'm sure nothing is more dangerous than you, White Falcon, Baron thought to himself. The prince pushed on, continuing his journey toward his destination. Near the bridge he needed to cross, a group of people had gathered. Baron wondered what they were up to and tried to slip past, but suddenly his horse reared up, spooked by something. The prince struggled to calm his mount, which seemed terrified for no apparent reason. A man from the group walked over to the young prince. He explained that the dead were beginning their final journey, and asked the prince to hold off for a moment if he wasn't in a massive hurry. The prince nodded immediately, catching on to what the journey of the dead meant, looked down at the river, and realized it was a funeral rite. Getting off his horse, the prince said he could wait, as he had no intention of disrespecting someone's final send-off. Every nation has its own way of saying goodbye to the departed. The Syrians, for instance, believe that souls leave this world carried away on red flowers drifting down the river. They say that crossing bridges while those flowers are passing by can lead souls astray. Back in his homeland Secretia, he used to lay sinistar flowers on graves to mourn the dead. Those white sinistar petals fade at sunrise and bloom into deep violet hues under the night sky. It's a reminder that the living and the dead, like day and night, are forever divided. This rite marked the end of the secretion, way of saying farewell to loved ones. Baron waited patiently until the ceremony concluded. Deep down, Prince Baron couldn't help but wonder if his brother had ever placed a sinistar flower on his own grave, or if he'd used the storm Arcus before that moment. An idea would have clicked. He himself might just be a lost soul, led down a dark and twisted path. The man who had asked the prince to wait for the ritual thanked him for his patience and told him he was free to move on. The young prince just watched, silent as a grave. He mounted his horse, figuring the past didn't matter anymore, since he was the prince of Kirus now. Then the prince pulled back his hood and told the man that the souls could finally journey in peace, and that it was time for them to rest. The man was stunned when he saw the prince's face. The prince then rode off, crossing the bridge. As the man watched him leave, someone else caught his eye to finish up the ritual. She asked if anything had happened, and he brushed it off, saying nothing at all. That man was Arsene, the High Magistrate of Volcanum. He was the very man responsible for Baron's death. Back when Baron was the Prince of Secretia, Arsene pulled back his own hood and told his companion that the guy he'd just spoken to seemed like a decent person. Every shop I've passed so far is named Sixpagnon Baron, thought staring at a tavern also called Sixpagnon. He muttered to himself, honestly, that's just insane. All the spies who claimed Ceres was crawling with Sixpagnon loyalists. They weren't wrong. Baron walked into the tavern, and a man greeted him with a welcoming smile. He offered to find him a table, but the young prince brushed him off. He said he had business on the 4th floor. When he pointed upward, the man looked completely caught off guard by the answer. With a hushed, stifled voice, he gave in and opened the door to let the prince through. The man gestured, then led the way with the prince following close behind. The man opened a door and wished him a pleasant time. Kalyan stepped into a room that was totally empty, furnished only with a few tables and chairs. He spotted a coat rack bolted to the wall that looked a bit out of place. That's when Kalyan remembered the intel, the secret info he'd bought from the White Falcon. It was the location of the criminal underworld's hub in the Cerese royal capital. The prince grabbed the coat rack, and as he cranked it to the left, he triggered the mechanism. The wall groaned as a secret door slid open right next to it. Asked to be taken to the 4th floor of this 2-story building. That was the password to get in. It was all a front. The upper levels were just a facade for the hidden basement below. As they descended the stairs, they kept in mind that the place they were looking for wasn't the gambling den on the 3rd floor, where people just bet small change. No, it was something much deeper and darker. The prince reached a door and pushed it open slowly. Inside, men were tearing each other apart. It looked like a brutal fighting ring, surrounded by a crowd watching the carnage. This was exactly where the prince needed to be. The crowd was roaring hungrily, demanding that the fighters show more blood. They had all placed their bets on who was the toughest beast in the ring. Then the announcer shrieked that there was a winner, another victory for Gerard the Affectionate. Payout tickets would be handed out. Shortly, the announcer declared, "Those who bet on the white side, don't forget to collect your winnings." Meanwhile, the defeated fighter was dragged out of the ring, the crowd cursing him viciously. Standing in the corner, the prince thought, "The air is so thick it's suffocating, and these screams, they belong to people who have lost their humanity," he concluded. Watching the chaos, he thought, what a disgusting spectacle. A man approached Baron, catching his eye and reminding him that he hadn't paid his entry fee yet. The Baron handed over the payment, and the man signaled an attendant to escort him to table 27. A stunning young woman with blue hair and a red dress walked up to the prince. She took his arm and motioned for him to follow. The prince wondered if she couldn't speak. The young woman turned slightly, and Kalyan caught a glimpse of her ear. He was shocked it was mangled. She definitely isn't wearing those clothes by choice. The prince thought, noting the tracking collar locked around her neck. He fell deep into thought about how they were all kept under such tight surveillance. Then the young woman nudged him. She pointed at him, then at a tray as if asking if he wanted to place a bet. Baron reached into his pocket, figuring he'd better play along. "I'll play their game until I get what I came here for," he thought, placing his money on the black side of the board. The rules were simple in joints like this. You bet on the fighters, and the winning side doubled their take. Bet 3, walk away with 6. Bet 6, get 12. And so on. The payouts were massive. Just then, the winner of the 10th fight of the night was announced. Pantheon of the Steel Feet. Again, the announcer declared that the payout tickets would be distributed shortly. Those who bet on the black side, don't forget to collect your winnings. Everyone was stunned to see the Baron's 3 florins turn into $15.36. People stared at the pile of cash on the table, whispering to each other. Baron, however, knew he wasn't here for the money. The final fight of the night, 4 times the payout. That's right. The special match everyone had been waiting for. The announcer bellowed. In the white corner, we have the unstoppable Raging Hammer, and in the black corner, the stubborn, unyielding Challenger. The prince couldn't believe his eyes. Seeing the Challenger brought back a memory. Kairo once saw this man claim he was a fighter in the pits, forced to spill blood for pocket change until his little sister passed away, a tragedy that twisted his fate forever. The announcer roared, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you..." As the man warmed up for the bout, someone asked, "Do you wish to be a knight, Kyrie?" He placed a hand over his heart. "Not a knight, my prince. I am but a sword. My only desire is to be your blade." Kyrie recalled that final moment, his friend urging him to grab his blade and never, ever give up. Suddenly, Kairo was announced to the ring. The announcer dubbed him the Demonic Eye. Without hesitation, the young prince took his coins and slammed them onto the betting table. He shouted that he was betting everything on the black corner. The clerk was stunned, and a hush fell over the entire arena. They couldn't believe he bet his entire fortune on such a man. People whispered, wondering if he was a fool or just completely insane. He just offered a faint smile, as if he held all the cards. The announcer jeered. With 0 wins, Kairo has never tasted victory in this arena. Will he rewrite his history today? A massive blonde man leaned forward, turning to Baron, asking if the young prince was really sure about throwing his money away like that. The man told him to put his chips on the other fighter, since the one he chose had never won a single fight. Baron then asked the attendant if she had finished counting his chips yet. He reaffirmed his bet on the black corner, demanding she seal the deal. The blonde man grew annoyed, insisting he was just trying to offer a warning, especially since it wasn't his own money. "At stake," the announcer finished. "The Raging Hammer rarely lets his opponents leave in one piece." As the crowd cheered like savages, Kairo kept his eyes locked on the rookie he had staked everything on. As they prepared to clash, Kairo's opponent spat out, "Another rookie. This is exactly what happens when you let a bastard who refuses to stay down into the ring." The 2 fighters squared off, and the match began before their chains even hit the ground. The opponent lunged instantly. The Raging Hammer launched his assault without a second to breathe. Kairo scrambled to defend, shielding his head. Just as he blocked one blow, another strike whipped in from the left. However, Kairo managed to guard against that one too. The Raging Hammer taunted him, sneering, "You're too slow," and planted a brutal kick into his stomach, sending him flying backward. Kairo coughed up blood, while the bloodthirsty crowd screamed for the Raging Hammer to end the carnage. Baron, unable to watch, slammed his hand onto the table, his face twisted in fury. "Without his sword, is Kyrie nothing but a punching bag?" Baron demanded. "This should be easy for him. Why is he getting hammered?" Kairo tried to throw a punch, but he was so sluggish that his opponent just laughed at him. The Raging Hammer countered with a crushing blow, telling Kairo to just quit already. He kept raining down strikes, relentless and cruel. "This is where it ends for you," he roared. As the Raging Hammer wound up for what looked like the final blow, Baron stood up from his chair and shouted. He screamed for Kairo, catching his attention. Baron yelled at him to drop his shoulder, just for a split second. Before the fist landed, Kairo heard the order. He didn't know why, but as the blow whistled toward him, he dropped his shoulder, narrowly dodging the heavy strike. He crouched low, coiling up like a spring. Kairo loaded his fist for a counter. Baron, satisfied that his advice hit home, watched with bated breath. Kairo drove his fist into the Raging Hammer's gut with every ounce of power he had. He didn't stop. He kept hammering his opponent, blow after blow. There wasn't a hint of exhaustion in him. With a final, massive surge of force, Kairo smashed the Raging Hammer in the face. Teeth shattered. The Raging Hammer collapsed, crashing onto the canvas from the sheer impact. The entire arena went dead silent, stunned, because not a single soul believed Kairo could pull this off. People whispered, "Did you see that? It felt like a dream." Kairo had toppled the legendary Raging Hammer. The announcer awkwardly declared the victory for Kairo. The gamblers were livid, cursing the Raging Hammer, as almost all of them had lost their shirts betting against the rookie. Scanning the crowd, Kairo spotted the man who'd tipped him off on how to win. the young prince. Baron was absolutely thrilled with Kyrie's victory. But before Kyrie could even celebrate, a man approached from behind and gestured for him to follow. Baron turned to look at the guy who had approached Kyrie, immediately noting his massive muscular frame. With dark hair, the man announced that someone wanted a word with Kyrie. Kyrie followed him into a room. Sitting on the couch was a man. He was congratulating Kyrie on raking in so much cash with only 3 coins, while the man who had brought him there stood guard by the door. As the guard slowly drew his blade from its sheath, the man on the couch kept harping on about the huge sum of money. With a sinister grin that flashed a gold tooth, the man on the couch declared that a kid like Kyrie shouldn't be handling so much dough. Baron let out a faint smirk. Baron remarked that the guy didn't even have the decency to try a real negotiation, and that he was even dumber than Baron had expected. With a glare, Baron ordered the man to take off his hood, because he wanted a good look at his face, before breaking his nose. Holding the hood, Baron asked if the guy was sure about this. "That hood might be the only thing keeping you out of trouble," the prince warned. The man, looking curious, signaled his lackeys to step up and pull the hood down. 2 hulking thugs moved toward the young prince. One reached out for the young prince's hood, sneering, "Don't be shy. We just want to see the face you're hiding so hard." However, the hand reaching for the hood was quickly intercepted by a dagger. Dagger in hand, Baron asked the thug after the strike, "In your line of work, shouldn't you be a little faster? Where's your instinct?" The boss, stunned by Baron's dagger skills, claimed he just needed more time to get the money ready. Baron, twirling the blade, told the boss to keep his gold. In exchange, he'd take Kyrie, and pointed the dagger right at the boss. The boss argued that his master wouldn't be pleased, since the boy Kyrie had only just started making his living. "You're delusional if you think I'm taking that ridiculous offer," the boss thought. "Maybe you know how to hold your own in a scrap, but we've got the numbers advantage here," he concluded, eyeing the young man. Meanwhile, Baron kept his dagger leveled at the boss. The boss swore he wasn't handing over Kyrie. Suddenly, he was shocked by a sudden blur of motion. The boss's table was sliced in half, along with a chunk of his pants. The young man then said, "You can keep the gold and your life." Dagger in hand, radiating mana, Baron asked the boss if he finally had his full attention. The boss, overwhelmed by fear and dread, asked if that was sword aura. He barked at a thug, screaming at him to get out there and grab Kyrie. Kalia wasn't hoping to have to repeat a display like that, because, as expected, Kalia's body couldn't withstand the force of that aura for long. Soon, the thug who'd gone to fetch Kyrie returned, reporting a problem. The boss, still clutching his shredded pants, demanded to know what the issue was. The thug explained that Kyrie wouldn't leave Ina behind. The name Ina seemed to spark something in Kalyan's mind. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Kyrie back when they still shared the same body. Kyrie had confessed that his sister had made an irreversible choice after he left. Thinking back, he felt a crushing sense of regret for not being there for her. Kalyan slapped the boss on the shoulder, declaring he knew what to do. The boss, desperate, shouted at them to bring the girl along too. However, Kalyan stated he'd prefer to get her himself, while the boss assured him that no one would bother him on the way. Kalyan held out his hand. The boss didn't get the meaning of the gesture. Kalyan, with a mocking tone, told the boss to pay him back the 3 florins and the entrance fee. Outside the establishment, Kalyan and his horse waited while Kyrie and Ina stood a little way behind. Ina was trembling, completely bewildered by the chaos unfolding around her. Kyrie pulled her into a protective embrace, shielding her from the danger. Kyrie thanked Kalyan for whisking them away to safety, but Kalyan just stayed silent. He stood there watching them closely from the corner of his eye. Kyrie confessed he had no idea why this stranger was helping them, especially with something fast approaching. In a flash, Kalyan draped his own coat over Ina, telling them they could lower their guard around him. He promised he meant them no harm. When Kalyan pulled back his hood, revealing his face, Kyrie froze in shock. He had recognized Prince Kalyan. He bowed his head in haste, apologizing for not recognizing His Highness sooner. Kalyan reached out and rested a hand on Kyrie's shoulder. He told the boy to look up. He insisted they didn't need to bow to him. "Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this, hit that like button." Looking at them, Kalyan could vividly recall the tragic fate they had suffered in his past life. Kyrie hadn't been strong enough to save his sister. "You have a habit of leaving your shoulders exposed when you fight," Kalyan noted, a common mistake for anyone just starting to learn the blade. The prince then asked, "Do you want to be a knight? Is that why you're training so hard?" Kairi replied that he didn't care about becoming a knight. Instead, he wanted to be a sword that could protect everyone. The young prince was genuinely surprised. Kalyan then held out his own blade. He handed it to Kairi, explaining that to become the weapon he dreamed of being, he would have to act as his shield. That was the price for Kalyan to teach him the art of swordsmanship. He told Kairi to find him once he had made up his mind. Kairi asked, why was the prince being so kind to them? Kalyan offered a faint smile, saying he needed a sharp blade. But in his own mind, Kalyan knew it was the absolute least he could do for his old comrade. Meanwhile, the streets of Tenong Junction were completely empty. It was already deep into the night. Tucked away was the Mage Association office. Manasal was busy reviewing the report sent to the cavalry headquarters. The prince is worried about Pelin and wants us to keep a close watch on him. Pelin discovered a cut rope during the last banquet. Manasal finished reading aloud, then set the letter ablaze. As the parchment turned to ash, Manasal stared into the flames, wondering how his apprentice had known about all of that. Suddenly, Prince Kalyan burst in, soaked in sweat, and his clothes looking like a mess. He announced his arrival with a look of relief. Mage Manasal scanned him from head to toe, taking in his disheveled state. "Have you been in a fight, Your Highness?" the mage asked. The prince sat down, replying that some unexpected things had gone down. As the mage went to pour some tea, he couldn't help but notice the young prince had clearly had a very long day. "It's been a long one," Kalyan sighed. "I was digging for intel and set a trap with Dorsey." As he stretched out his sore muscles, the prince wondered why the mage looked so concerned, instead of being impressed by everything he had pulled off in such a short time. The mage just kept watching him, while he poured the tea. When the prince saw the mage using magic to prepare it, he was mesmerized. Finally, he felt like he was in a real mage's office. The mage noticed Kalyan's excitement and teased him, asking if he was expecting some creepy potion with an eyeball floating in it. The prince chuckled. Almost. Right as he finished answering, Kalyan glanced at the table and spotted a dagger. It looked dull. Remarking that it seemed out of place, he leaned in closer, and something about it caught his eye. It was the same dagger he had picked up earlier. The mage asked what the prince's dagger was doing there, his tone filled with surprise. Kalyan said that shouldn't be possible. Then it zipped straight toward the prince's chest. As it closed in, Kalyan realized it was way too late to dodge. The mage just stood there, watching it all with his arms crossed. He remarked that even with such a weakened body, Kalyan's reflexes were top tier. The prince, by tapping into the aura of his own blade, channeling his power through the aura of his own blade. Before the dagger even hit the ground, it bounced back. The mage explained it was a magical artifact, a relic forged by Sulpician himself. It manifests a copy of the opponent's hidden weapons, the mage noted, holding the blade like a grim warning. "Quite something, don't you think?" he asked. The prince was gasping for air. Channeling mana was always agony. Kalyan figured this had to be just a test, but he'd been reckless, doing far more than necessary. The mage pressed him. How could it be more than necessary when Kalyan didn't even know how to properly grip a sword? The prince sat slumped on the couch, hand over his chest, still wheezing until the mage placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. He began to talk about the day they first met. It hadn't gone exactly as planned, but the mage knew that things were slowly starting to feel off. The mage produced records of his conversations with the king, where the monarch marveled at Kalyan's sudden transformation and spoke of similar talks with the queen. She had noted that upon discovering he'd been poisoned, Kalyan showed a stronger will to live than any fear of death. That kind of resolve only comes from someone who has spilled mountains of blood, the mage stated. Plus, the mage already knew an incident would break out at the cavalry showcase. He demanded to know if the prince could explain everything. As the healing magic knit his body back together, the prince felt a surge of rapid recovery. During his recovery, Baron wondered if the mage was onto him. But he soon realized the man was simply trying to build trust. Slamming his hand on the table, Baron declared that he was not Kalyan. His true name, he revealed, was Baron Secrethia. The two men sat face to face. The mage asked him to confirm first and foremost if the real Prince Kalyan was dead. Baron shook his head, explaining it wasn't that simple. At first he'd had his doubts, but now he was certain that Kalyan was still alive. He could feel his presence. The mage recalled the day of their first encounter, when Kalyan had claimed the throne wasn't what he wanted. He asked Baron what he truly desired. Calmly, Baron replied that his wish was to put an end to the wars. He still didn't understand why Carrie sought the axis of time, but he feared that if the root cause remained, history would just keep repeating itself. He needed to uncover the reason behind it all. The mage asked with cold serenity whether Baron's goals were for the sake of hunting the legitimate heir, or purely for his own interests as a baron. Baron didn't grasp the intent, and asked what he meant. The mage replied that there was something crucial Baron had to understand. As of now, Christian is the crown prince. He explained that Chase was born to a concubine, and since the queen was unable to bear children, logically, there was no place for Baron in that lineage. The revelation hit Baron like a physical blow, sitting there in Prince Kalyan's skin. Baron felt himself slipping into a bottomless void, completely lost, tangled in his own thoughts. He wondered if he truly didn't exist anywhere not at Secrethia, not anywhere at all. The prince was swallowed by his musings and his mounting dread, questioning why and how this could have happened. Kalyan's body was in perfect health, but deep down, Baron felt something profoundly wrong. The prince confessed that sometimes he wondered if someone else had entered his own body, just as he had taken over Kalyan's. He added, "As long as I draw breath, there can never be another Baron." The young man seemed haunted by the entire situation. He knew that at its core, his existence was no different than stealing another man's life. The mage then tried to break down the situation in Secretia, declaring that Chase was the one and only heir to the throne. He looked him in the eye and said, "You must understand that the past and the present aren't the same anymore, and the future, well, it may have been rewritten." He pressed on. "Listen to me. The three princes of Kiris are facing death, unlike you, the Prince of Secretia, who was raised surrounded by the truest friends anyone could ask for." The mage's face remained stone cold, while Baron, trapped inside Kalyan's body, was caught completely off guard. The mage added that this meant he shouldn't be shackled by the past. Baron decided to set the record straight with him, making it clear that his worst fears wouldn't come to pass. He revealed that from the very first day he arrived in Kairos, the moment he opened his eyes, right then and there, he had let go of his old life as Baron. His words left the mage stunned, as he never expected such a cold, hard truth. Baron then demanded to know if the mage was truly okay with how things stood, even if he wasn't the crown prince of Kiris. A faint smile touched the mage's lips as he told Baron he had nothing to worry about. He could guarantee that from the very beginning. Only one person had been tethered to him. As the priest mounted his horse, Baron couldn't help but wonder if the sorcerer knew the truth about the time Arcus. He decided to get straight to the point and asked if the mage had any deep knowledge regarding the axis of time. The sorcerer kept his expression unreadable as he rode alongside Baron. Then the sorcerer began to explain how, just last year, during that very same month, Prince Chase had come to him seeking guidance on the temporal axis. The sorcerer himself had gone undercover in Secretia, but he couldn't dig up any information other than the fact that the artifact wasn't man-made. Then, last month, he received a letter from Secretia about the axis vanishing. The moment Baron mentioned he had traveled 10 years back in time, he was shocked to realize that his time leap coincided exactly with the moment the time Arcus disappeared. Baron suggested that this was likely the cause of its disappearance. Before he could even finish, the sorcerer cut him off, stating that while it was a massive lead, he still didn't have a solid answer. He did mention, however, that there was someone else he could ask, someone who knew even more than he did, and that the prince would be meeting this person soon. As mentioned before, this individual was from Hispania. Prince Kalyan simply nodded at the sorcerer's plan. His rite of passage was drawing near, a ceremony held whenever a new member enters Hispanian royalty. And that is exactly when everyone learns the true will of the Hispanian line. The sorcerer stressed that the main priority was staying alive long enough to finish the rite, urging the prince to do whatever was necessary to survive. Baron countered with a sharp question. What if I fail? The seeds had already been sown and were beginning to sprout. Back at the palace, in his private chambers, Kalyan's servant was visibly anxious about the prince's departure. The prince was studying the plant he'd received from the sorcerer, and it seemed he had spotted something strange. Meanwhile, his servant suggested he wash his face before turning in for the night. With a sly smile, the prince asked his servant if he wanted to see something fascinating. They made their way to the palace terrace. It was barely dawn, and the air was biting cold. This plant we received as a gift from the Mage Society is incredibly rare, so it has properties most people don't even know about. The prince thought to himself, that day I faked an accident and poured poison into the flower pot without anyone noticing, just to see how the servants would react. Meanwhile, an ordinary person wouldn't last 7 days with that poison, let alone a plant. Yet the plant was still thriving, as if someone had deliberately swapped it while out on the terrace. Jan the servant caught a glimmer of something brilliant and drew the prince's attention to it. He was mesmerized by the intensity of the glow. A trail of light was shimmering across the palace courtyard. If someone swapped it, they wouldn't find it easy to get rid of the pot. They have to keep it somewhere. Safe, the prince mused. And that is how I'll find the truth, he concluded. Of course, the master of the palace, Izia, the prince mused, Silesia awaits. The next day dawned under a relentless downpour. The prince stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. Footsteps echoed in his chamber. He turned, keen to see who had arrived. It was Jan, bearing a tray of tea, who greeted him with a polite, "Good morning." The prince asked Jan if he'd slept soundly, noting that he looked exceptionally bright-eyed and refreshed this morning. Jan, caught off guard, confirmed he'd slept well, and ventured to ask if His Highness had enjoyed a restful night as well. Setting the tea tray down, Jan couldn't help but find it strange for the prince to inquire about his sleep, adding that even Kalyan had risen early today. Jan joked that it must be an omen. Perhaps the sun would rise in the west today. The prince simply lifted his teacup to take a sip. As he drank, Jan asked if the sound of the rain had stirred him from his slumber. It's subtle, the prince thought to himself, but I can still see. You've increased the dose of poison, haven't you? The prince reflected. He asked Jan if there were any upcoming events next week, where the nobility would be gathered. His servant confirmed a grand meeting was scheduled, attended by all the nobles, including His Majesty the King. The prince then learned that a banquet would follow, a week after the meeting, and he realized that day would be the perfect opportunity to test his celestial leap. Enjoy it while you still can, the prince thought. He then produced the pill given to him by the mage and swallowed it as nonchalantly as if it were a piece of candy. He handed the cup back to Jan, who then posed a question of his own. He wanted to know if the prince had been eating properly lately, to which Kalyan replied that he'd been strictly consuming his nutritional supplements. Closing his pill pouch, the prince mentioned he felt a bit weak and requested breakfast to be served. Jan agreed and moved to help His Highness prepare. The servant couldn't help but be surprised, noticing the prince had drained the entire cup of tea. Jan wondered why the prince seemed so preoccupied, even at the breakfast table. After the incident at the theater, Blanche was nowhere to be seen at the meal. Kalyan figured it was for the best, ensuring Blanche wouldn't interfere with his plans, while the first prince, Randall, sat nearby sipping his wine. Kalyan remarked that the roses would be in full bloom quite soon. Randall looked up startled by the comment and fixed a sharp gaze on Kalyan, who only offered a cryptic smile in return. They locked eyes for a tense moment. Randall abruptly rose from the table and departed without finishing his meal, Jan whispered, asking if the prince didn't find it a bit random to bring up roses right at breakfast. Kalyan replied that he'd merely spotted some flowers in the hallway and recalled how fond Randall was of them. The servant thought that explanation sounded thin, but Kalyan simply kept drinking his coffee. Soon after, Prince Kalyan was out in the castle garden, training amidst the pouring rain. Soaked to the bone, a mixture of sweat and rainwater dripping off him, he leaned against a tree, gasping for breath. Someone approached, noting that his condition seemed to be worsening by the day, and asking what he was doing out there. The prince replied that if he continued to avoid physical training, he'd never see any improvement. It was his master, the mage, who had suddenly appeared. The sorcerer muttered that he was just talking to the mine. The prince was surprised to hear him address someone by their first name. The sorcerer shrugged, saying there was no harm in it. It was just a common name. The sorcerer then asked why the prince had summoned him, and Kalyan answered that he had 2 favors to ask. The first was that he needed 2 new identities, which the sorcerer promised he could easily arrange. The prince added that the second task was to investigate the recent noble deaths, specifically any connection to Romain. They spoke in unison, exchanging knowing smiles. The sorcerer brushed it off, saying it was no trouble at all, and that he appreciated Kalyan's politeness in asking. He then asked if the prince was in a hurry. The sorcerer noted that the amount of poison had definitely increased, and that he believed he'd identified the culprit. The sorcerer said he had a strong lead on who it was, and the prince warned that he would soon begin turning up the pressure. I know it's hard to get a hold of a master sorcerer, Kalyan concluded, but a master always needs an ace up his sleeve. Mana. With a piercing gaze, Marin asked if Kalyan was planning to use him as a mere distraction. He replied, not as a distraction, but as a weapon. Indeed, a weapon. I understand the power of sorcerers better than anyone. They're the ones who slaughtered me in my own land. The sorcerer army. The white demons. He then declared his intent to forge a society of sorcerers, one that would remain loyal only to him. Manassil was left stunned by the young prince's ambition. He explained that sorcerers aren't like knights. They are born with power, not trained for it. Baron then revealed there was something he hadn't shared yet, a secret that had proven effective in the previous timeline, which immediately seized the sorcerer's full attention. Back when King Romain first proposed establishing his own sorcerer guild in Kalis, everyone, including the nobility, laughed in his face. The idea was tossed aside, but it allowed the king to launch his secret plan without drawing any public suspicion. Yet, despite his success shortly after the society was consolidated, King Romain passed away under highly suspicious circumstances. With the king dead, the society swore loyalty to his heir, Planche becoming a mere pawn in his conquest, just as Manassil already knew. But this time, the prince declared, I will not let that happen so easily. Baron knew he had to tread carefully, as the House of Romain would stop at nothing to sabotage his schemes. Baron revealed that his trump card was the poisoned tea Celeste had been feeding him. The sorcerer didn't follow the prince's logic, and asked Kalyan to explain. With a wry smile, the prince promised the truth would soon come to light. Disappointed by the vague answer, the sorcerer was advised to speak with the king. As Kalyan suspected, the monarch was deeply troubled. The prince assured him that he could rest easy, noting, Kalechi is bound to make mistakes and will be forced to negotiate. We must seize this chance to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a maid reported, We're applying more poison, just as your majesty commanded. Slamming her hand on the table, the queen snarled that she would not tolerate a single mistake. Rumors were already swirling among the commoners. I loathe such gossip. How long must I deal with this nuisance? The queen demanded. Trembling with fear, the maid vowed it wouldn't happen again. As she spoke, a man approached the table. The queen declared she had no choice as her disobedient son refused to shoulder his own responsibilities. It was Planche, his face twisted in anger. He snapped that the queen was overstepping her bounds, and he had come there to make that perfectly clear. The queen retorted that his opinion mattered little, as he had taken no steps to secure a promising future. Dramatically, the queen sighed, claiming these were simply the pains of motherhood. If she had to do whatever it took for her son's sake, so be it. Planche's knuckles turned white as he clenched his fist in pure rage. Abruptly, he turned his back on his mother and stormed off. Sipping her tea, the queen mused that he was far too fragile. Her path to the throne would surely be unchallenged. Then the moving day arrived. The weather was glorious, and someone was humming a tune, clearly in high spirits. You've been singing all day, Kyrie teased. Are you that excited? She asked. We're finally heading to the royal palace, and that means we'll see the prince again, Ina replied. Kyrie asked if she had a crush on him, and Ina admitted the prince was amazing, and she couldn't wait for the evening. Meanwhile, at the palace, the tailor and his staff were preparing the prince's attire. Ian was putting the final touches on the outfit, warning that the prince needed to be at the banquet in an hour. The prince told him he needed a favor. He felt it was time to put an end to this little game. The younger and weaker ones had been forced to drink and ended up poisoned. But from now on, they would refuse with elegance and poise. As he entered the banquet hall, the vassal announced the prince's arrival. He and the queen locked eyes for a brief moment. The time had come to begin. A new wave of change was rolling in. Meanwhile, Ian was galloping on horseback, his mind racing as fast as his steed. He was fixated on the prince's urgent request to deliver 2 letters, starting with the one for the arcane enclave. He had to get to the enclave first, before heading over to Master Allen's place with the second letter. The prince had promised he'd be taken care of, and that everything would be fine. But Ian couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. This wasn't the first time the prince had pulled a stunt like this. As Ian's thoughts spiraled, he felt a sudden, unprompted wave of anxiety. Flashback to the banquet. A wine glass shattered against the floor. The sound jolted everyone in the room, especially the king. Someone had collapsed right in front of the queen. Back at the enclave, a woman with violet hair informed Manasseh that every document he'd asked for was finally there. She confirmed the official records were enough to make their case. Her name was Uriah Saran. As the leader of the Cirician Arcane Enclave, she couldn't believe something this monumental had been buried from the public. The mage sighed, noting that the nobles never really had a choice. Lesser houses wouldn't dare make enemies. Of the Roman house Uriah finished. It was all about saving their own skins from a tragic accident. Grimly, Uriah asked Manasseh if he had any inkling of what Prince Callion was actually planning with this kind of leverage. Manasseh fell silent, deep in thought, before the door suddenly burst open. A voice called out for Lady Uriah. It was Ian, breathless and drenched in sweat from his desperate ride. Seeing both recipients there, he visibly relaxed. Ian handed Prince Callion's letter to Manasseh. While Manasseh scanned the contents, Ian passed the second letter to Uriah. Manasseh stood up in a flash, grabbed his cloak, and demanded to know where the night's banquet was being held. Ian was taken aback. He stammered, wondering why Manasseh was rushing off and reminding him that he needed an invitation. Uriah cut him off, shouting that there was no time for formalities because Callion's life was on the line. Ian was clearly stunned by Uriah's outburst. The letter revealed that tonight, Callion was willing to bet his life to force Colsey into negotiations, and if things went south, he was counting on Manasseh to save him. 1 hour. Before all this, Callion had been sitting face to face with the queen sipping tea. He suggested they both drop their masks. The queen signaled her refusal by tapping her fan sharply against the table. She coolly remarked that it wouldn't make much difference, all while taking another calm sip of her tea. Callion replied that he meant dropping their metaphorical masks, not their manners, while locking eyes with her. A battle of wits. Is that really the best you can do? I was hoping for something more surprising, the queen scoffed. She rose to her feet, declaring she expected better and regretted wasting her time. She added that a commoner like Callion would never understand the grace required to entertain guests properly. Callion simply shot back that he knew exactly what was in the tea, the poison. Setting his cup down, Callion said he had reached his limit and couldn't imagine developing a taste for it. The queen feigned ignorance, tilting her head and asking what he meant, all while maintaining a thin, dangerous smile. She teased that his little joke hadn't landed as intended. Callion calmly told her not to worry, because he had come prepared. He believed there were other ways to sharpen one's mind. Looking weakened, he muttered that he was left wondering what he'd have to gamble to ensure she stayed in line, as he reached for a small vial. The only thing I truly have of value is this heart. So I decided to take the gamble, the prince confessed. Holding up the vial, Callion revealed that the substance inside could stop a heart for a brief moment. The queen leaned in, focused, as Callion spoke. The prince claimed that neither silver spoons nor magical detectors could sniff out the toxin, and that it would have no effect on him, because his heart was shielded by the blessing of Cusbanian. However, since the blessing could only nullify one curse at a time, drinking this poison would allow it to flood his body and kill him instantly. If I were to drop dead from poison right here in your presence, who do you think they'd come after? The prince asked, his voice steady. The queen's response was pure disdain. She let out a cold, mocking laugh, right? She scoffed, asking if he really thought he could threaten her with something so pathetic. telling him not to get any wild ideas. "Do you honestly think you're the first enemy I've had to deal with this way?" She went on cold as ice, stating that the whole world knew she was the one who killed Kalyan's mother, yet they all chose to keep their mouths shut. "What makes you think this time would be any different?" Hearing those words, the prince's blood began to boil. Kalyan then looked at the queen and asked her what he was supposed to do about it. With a wicked smirk playing on her lips, she told him to go ahead and do whatever he felt he had to do. The prince didn't hesitate. He grabbed the tea and downed it in one gulp. The queen just watched him, wearing a cruel, satisfied grin. She called him a fool, asking who on earth would dare hold her accountable. Not even Roman himself, she thought with a smug smile, could ever force me to bend to his will. She mused that there wasn't a single thing Charisse had that she couldn't take for herself, including the throne. Over the years, I've simply swept anyone in my way aside, and I've always gotten exactly what I wanted. There's only one thing left. There was still one more piece of the puzzle that belonged to her, she thought, casting a glance at the king. As the banquet began, someone suddenly started hacking and coughing. The queen observed the chaos with hidden amusement, thinking that now, finally, he was out of the way. Suddenly, Prince Kalyan collapsed to the ground, spewing what looked like strawberry juice from his mouth. The entire banquet hall erupted in panic. Who would be the first to rush over and try to help him? Someone was screaming at the top of their lungs for a priest. Behind her, Fan the queen hid a malicious, twisted smile. Kalyan lay sprawled right at the queen's feet. The room was consumed by desperation, and 1,000 questions filled the air. Was the drink actually poisoned? Had he been poisoned long before the banquet even started? Who had he been with before showing up here? One man barked at everyone to be silent, warning them that their heads were on the line if they didn't. The queen felt absolutely triumphant, knowing that not a soul dared to point a finger at her. The king sprinted over to Kalyan, cradling the prince in his arms, begging him to hold on. Kalyan called him father, which caught the king off guard. The king was suddenly flooded with the memory of the day Kalyan's mother died and how she had begged him to protect their son. Kalyan tried to gasp out some final words, but his voice failed him, so he just pointed a trembling finger. The king seemed to grasp exactly what the prince was trying to say. The queen feigned shock at such a disgraceful scene in her palace, declaring that she couldn't bear to stay any longer, claiming she would head back to her chambers, even as the king held the prince tightly in his arms. The king, his rage barely contained, wondered how she could be so bold to do this to his own son. Then he roared the queen's name aloud. The whole room went deathly silent. Nobody had ever expected to witness a confrontation like this. The queen spun toward the king, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to pure bewilderment. Then the murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Some whispered that the two of them had been seen together earlier. Others wondered if she really had poisoned him, and many muttered that it wouldn't shock them in the slightest if she had. The queen gripped her fan so hard her knuckles turned white. She raised it to hide her face and snapped that he had no idea what he was babbling about, asking if the prince hadn't been suffering from some chronic illness all this time. The king, lost in a blind rage, shot back that she had been there when Freya died, and every single night there had backed her story. He remembered her claiming Freya died from some celestial illness. Even if that were true, you'd still be the one to blame, the king snarled. The queen asked who could prove he had ever been healthy, scoffing that nobody would ever believe such a thing. With a sly smile, she added, "Perhaps the princes who have breakfast with him every single day know all about Kalyan's health. Why don't you try asking them?" the queen taunted. The king ordered her to shut her mouth. She scoffed, mocking him by pretending she was just deeply concerned amidst all this confusion. "Our son's condition is just getting worse." The king drew his sword, consumed by fury, and demanded to know how she dared call him our son. Someone in the crowd whispered that if anyone shouldn't be saying that, it was her. The queen's face darkened in an instant. Blanche stood his ground, insisting that Kalyan had been perfectly fine and that he had never noticed anything wrong with him. At least, that was how he had seemed during their last meeting. At that moment, the queen turned her lethal gaze toward Blanche. The heavy doors swung open, signaling the arrival of the priest. The queen seized the moment to slip back to the Igi palace, while the king turned to the holy man. He was there to heal the prince, and the priest began readying his sacred magic to perform the ritual. Suddenly, a shimmering protective barrier manifested around the prince's body. Someone had appeared right behind the priest, cutting off his magic. It was the mage Manasil. Manasil rushed in, sweating and breathless, declaring that she wanted the prince dead. The king was livid, demanding to know what the hell she thought she was doing. She insisted that Prince Kalyan was in critical condition. The mage explained that the prince had a magical circle embedded in his heart. If that circle made contact with holy power, no matter how lucky he was, his heart would detonate and he would die instantly. We all need to be careful. Stunned, the king asked what they could possibly do if the holy power wouldn't work. Was magic even an option? The mage replied that if they could find a healer gifted with the power of nature, there might be a glimmer of hope. But with standard magic, it was impossible. The king barked an order for her to find a solution, and fast. The prince's suffering was clear. As she struggled, Manasil was haunted by a flash from her own past. She remembered a moment that had terrified her to her core. A man had been kneeling there, blood spilling from his mouth. It was the exact same sight as Kalyan right now. The dying man had asked why this was happening to him. Back in the present, Mage Manasil cradled Prince Kalyan's head. She slumped to the floor, pulling his head onto her lap. Kalyan, his vision blurring, gazed up at his master's face and whispered, "Why are you making that face?" Manasil thought to herself that she never imagined she would be forced to use this forbidden spell again. In her mind, she saw herself casting the same magic on that man from long ago, promising that the magic would take away his pain, referring to him as an entity. Days bled into one another. People were bustling through the streets as a couple walked by. Suddenly, a piece of paper fluttered through the air toward them. The paper slapped against the man's face, making him jump. When he looked up, he saw countless other papers raining down. They were all leaflets, screaming for the truth to be revealed, about the royal prison family, responsible for the deaths of 37 people. The prison family was caught in the eye of a massive scandal. Rumors that the queen had tried to poison Kalyan, combined with the cruel history of the prison, had ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Nobody dared to be seen with them anymore. One wrong move and they would face the same ruin. Even the king himself had officially named Queen Cilicia as the culprit behind the poisoning. "The queen is a murderer," the crowds roared. The furious public vandalized the palace walls, demanding that Queen Cilicia be cast out once and for all. Mage Manasil recalled Prince Kalyan's earlier words that if they wanted to build a mage squad, they had to strike while Cilicia was down in the mud. As the king read what looked like a letter from the prince, he grew deep in thought. He was stunned to realize that Kalyan had come up with the same genius idea he had to form an elite mage troupe. Standing by Kalyan's bedside, Queen Cilicia remarked that the Mage Association must be keeping him very busy. With her face partially veiled by a fan, she asked when they had cooked up. Something like this. Kalyan played the fool, claiming he had no idea what she was talking about. The prince added that he had managed to get plenty of rest thanks to her, which was quite the twist, because for a guy who had been knocking on death's door, he looked surprisingly well. He went on to say that he had practically had one foot in the grave. Then, breaking into a cold sweat, Kalyan declared that given his weakened state, it would be difficult to hold a long conversation. "If you have nothing more to say, I think I'll get some rest," the prince concluded. The queen, clearly nervous, pressed him on what he thought about the negotiations. Without missing a beat, Kalyan replied that she should have brought that up a week ago, because things had changed since then. Still, he conceded that he would hear her out. The queen proposed a deal if he went public and claimed the accusations were lies. She wouldn't stand in the way of his plans. The prince let out a sharp, genuine laugh at her audacity, and told her she was completely misreading the situation. As the queen hid her furious expression behind her fan, the young prince told him he didn't need his permission, then demanded to know. Since there was nothing left for her to do there, the queen snatched up her fan, absolutely fuming. She then stood up, pointed a finger at Kalyan, and with a forced, icy smile, demanded to know what he actually wanted. Kalyan spoke out. "In a land ruled by the descendants of Kusbanian, why is the clash of steel so deafening? he concluded his point by declaring that he wanted the Pavel Knights disbanded. The queen was completely stunned, stammering, You want to get rid of all of them? The royal knights gifted to Kelets by Marquis Bryson, losing them would mean that Celeste would lose half her military might. Kalyan told her to dissolve Pavel and instead establish a troop of mages, adding that there were no other conditions. The queen was livid at his audacity. The prince then summoned his servant, who brought forward some documents and handed them to the queen. This, Kalyan said, sliding the paper toward the shell-shocked queen, is the testimony bound by the oath seal. The mere mention of the oath seal left her utterly shaken. The prince explained that this was a powerful magic that etched the terms of the contract directly into their hearts. If the oath were broken, their heart would be shattered, resulting in instant death. This was the reason Queen Celeste came to see Kalyan immediately after he woke up. Meanwhile, the first prince was tending to the roses in his garden. He spotted one that had fallen to the ground and fell into deep thought. His mind drifted back to the moment Kalyan had collapsed. Their eyes had met just seconds before he went down. He also recalled their conversation at the cafe when Kalyan mentioned that the roses would be blooming soon. It was then that he truly understood Kalyan's desire to be a part of that process. Curious to watch his roses finally blossom, he considered acting according to Kalyan's wishes. Back when Prince Kalyan collapsed, Randall had been about to speak. However, Blanche beat him to it, claiming that Kalyan had been perfectly fine just moments earlier. Randall was caught off guard as it was Blanche who had stepped in to help the prince. Randall realized that things were truly beginning to shift. Back in Kalyan's chamber, he continued explaining the mechanics of the oath to the queen. It was a binding magic that seared the terms of the contract onto their very souls. And if the pact was ever violated, their heart would be obliterated, leading to certain death. Given that there isn't exactly much trust between us, the prince stated coldly, Kalyan asked the queen what her next move would be. She remained frozen, as if in total shock. The queen snatched the quill from the servant's hand and began to sign the oath. The moment she signed, magical energy erupted. A glow enveloped her arm as she finished the signature, and just like that, the contract was sealed, chaining their hearts together with magical shackles. Enraged, the queen hurled the quill to the floor, snapping it in half as she turned to leave. Kalyan told her not to misunderstand the situation. He went on to explain that he had never had a good relationship with his siblings, and on that fateful day, when he was poisoned, Blanche didn't lift a finger to help him. If she had uttered even one more word back then, the king's blade would have taken his head off right there. In Celeste's mind, only the image of Blanche remained. She seemed visibly rattled by Kalyan's words. Regaining her composure and forced determination, she swept out of Prince Kalyan's room. Kalyan simply watched her leave. Sometime later, the mage entered the prince's room and expressed his shock at learning about her visit. Apparently, someone was devouring a mountain of bananas. The mage felt a bit more at ease, realizing that Kalyan was just extremely hungry. As Kalyan gobbled up in a banana, he remarked that they were delicious. The mage commented that since he'd barely survived, anything he ate would probably taste like heaven. The prince, with a faint smile, replied that he had done his part. Manazil was indignant at Kalyan's ability to smile, considering he had quite literally been on the doorstep of the grave. At that moment, he added that if it weren't for the elf siblings who had appeared at that exact second, and the stroke of luck that the girl named Ina was a healer attuned to the power of nature. Then, as the mage emphasized that Kalyan could have easily died, the prince simply looked surprised, because he had no idea that Ina was actually a healer. Manassil asked if he hadn't known that in his past life. The young man replied that back then, his only connection was with Kairi. By the time he met Kairi, Ina was already gone. The mage got the answers he was looking for, without needing to ask a single thing more. He was absolutely furious at Kalyan for downing that poison without any real plan to survive, gambling everything solely on the power of a blessing. As Kalyan scrambled to apologize, the mage tossed a paper at him. It was the official identification for the children Kalyan had requested earlier. The prince had completely forgotten about it. Suddenly, something caught the prince's eye, and took him by surprise. The two siblings had been registered with the surname Baron. The mage explained that they needed a family name, so he used his own former one, sensing that Kalyan hadn't brought them along by mere coincidence, all while watching the certificate, scrutinizing every tiny detail. Kalyan smiled and thanked the mage, noting that these weren't forgeries, but perfectly legitimate documents, and that the mage had vouched from the very start that the kids came from the Baron territory. The mage then revealed that Romain was the one who handled it, which caught the prince off guard. Menesil then asked how Kalyan felt about the rumors spreading, the whispers that he was the king's most beloved son. Kalyan wondered if those rumors were actually real, and the mage replied that after the king's display in front of all the nobles, it was inevitable. The prince felt torn by his own emotions, thinking that kind of affection was something someone else should have received. He sat back on the couch, lost deep in thought about the whole situation. Kalyan called out to Yan, telling him to clear the banana peels off the table. His servant Yan stepped forward and stood before him, watching him closely. He mentioned he had something to tell the prince, who asked what was on his mind. Yan stated clearly that he wanted to resign as his assistant. That declaration left the prince completely stunned. He hadn't seen it coming at all. A young child's foot touched the carpet. The boy went running through a magnificent palace hall, flanked by massive pillars in the background. On the left, up on the second floor, he headed toward his destination. He peered behind the wooden counter and shouted that he was there. In front of him, a man lay on the bed, deathly ill. His hands were swaddled in thick bandages. The boy, with a bright smile, greeted his brother, and in a hushed tone, his brother greeted him back. "Did you hear the crickets chirping this morning?" the boy asked his brother. "Crickets? Yeah, when summer kicks in, those horrible black bugs start screaming." "Like lunatics," the man replied grimly. The boy said with much more optimism that the crickets had very strange wings, and maybe they were making those loud sounds from inside themselves, using their stomachs. He suggested catching one the next morning to bring to him. The brother, wrapped in bandages from head to toe, told him not to do that, saying he hated crickets and begged him to just play the violin instead. "I heard your son is pretty skilled at medicine," the sick brother remarked. He replied that he was busy with something else. "How can I ask this?" Vincent's words were haunting. "Boy, sir, this really hurts me too. But there has to be another way," a man said. "I didn't realize back then just how terrifying the look of someone who is desperate for what they cannot have would be." The one looking at his brother called out to the boy, "Don't you dare look away. Look me straight in the eyes. Understand that I am dying," his brother said, locking gazes with him. Loud screams echoed out. "We have to run, grab his belongings and get him out of here." The fire was spreading fast. That was how it happened on the eve of my brother's 15th birthday. He made a desperate choice that changed everything for him and everyone in his life. After that day, summer simply drifted by. Autumn rolled in, then gave way to winter, and before long the crickets were chirping in the garden again as they slowly began to pull themselves back together. His father, unable to bear the sight of his son's suffering, finally brought him out of his room. He would still instinctively try to curl up in his father's arms, resting his head against his shoulder. "What kind of boy is he?" a voice suddenly asked. "He is the third prince of our kingdom," another replied, burying his face in his hands, mourning. The young man, with the crimson eyes, looked incredibly sorrowful. Kalyan could feel just how heavy the prince's heart truly was. "I want to resign from my position as a servant," Yan said timidly, looking up at Kalyan. The prince stared at him in shock. "No, what are you talking about?" Kalyan asked. Yan, sobbing, uncontrollably began to pour out his story. She, the person closest to the prince, confessed that she had no idea what was happening. Furthermore, she revealed that she was the one who had delivered the poison. Every morning the prince would watch his servant Yan, who always looked so startled. "It was my fault, oh Yan. I ignored the warning signs," he whispered. "I couldn't be by your side when you were in danger. I was blind to it all, and yet again, you nearly died because of me," Yan added. Then Yan saw the face of his deceased brother. "Don't turn away from the fact that I am dying," the apparition said, as if reaching out from the afterlife, hands outstretched toward Yan. "Yan, look at me. Prince Kalyan shouted urgently. The servant Yan blinked, his eyes brimming with tears as if snapping out of a trance. The prince then asked who was standing before him at that moment. The way he stared, it was clear he was waiting for an answer. Weeping Yan replied, "It is Prince Kalyan." Kalyan placed his hand over Yan's chest and declared that he was not going to die. "Ever since I opened my eyes here, you have been by my side, and it is only thanks to you that I've made it this far. I survived because you looked after me. I may not know much about you either, but I am certain of one thing. You will keep protecting me from now on, won't you?" the prince asked Yan. The prince's words only made Yan weep harder. Overcome with emotion, Yan fell to his knees. "Stop that now, and get up," the prince urged. Yan felt there was no turning back now. The prince reached out a hand to help him up. "There is someone here I must protect for the rest of my life," Yan thought to himself. Yan declared that he would get rid of anyone who dared to harm the prince. Kalyan asked what Yan meant, questioning if he intended to seek revenge. Yan replied that he had done it because they had hurt the prince. Kalyan then told him to stop, and reminded him that servants had to remain still, or else a war would break out. Yan told him to forget about the war even, if he wasn't acting under the authority of the Siegfried family. The prince addressed him as a servant. Shocked, Yan asked if he knew. Kalyan just shrugged and smiled. Yan asked how long he had known, and Kalyan gave a vague response. Yan insisted that this wasn't something the prince should know, and confessed that he hated his own father. Kalyan in turn declared that once he had taken care of the nuisances, he wanted a cup of coffee. Then Kalyan asked Yan if he wanted to bet on who would grow the most. In a dream, Baron saw Kalyan. They faced each other. Kalyan wore a calm smile, while Baron looked stunned. Kalyan then approached Baron, stepping incredibly close, still smiling, before quickly brushing past him. Baron watched Kalyan walk toward two other people. They seemed like lifelong friends. Kalyan then looked back at Baron, who was visibly terrified by the whole display. Baron reached out to Kalyan. Kalyan's smile faded, and he looked surprised. Then he smiled once more, this time with a confident gaze. Kalyan said something that jolted Baron awake. Then, with a smirk on his lips, Kalyan watched Baron as if he were falling. Baron collapsed right then and there, and Kalyan just stood there watching him. Baron woke up from the dream still inside Kalyan's body. He sat up in bed feeling completely bewildered. What exactly had occurred in his dream while he was presiding over the funeral of the previous Kalyan? Manazil asked if he had truly departed at the end. Kalyan replied that he suspected the original Kalyan might have simply wanted to finally indulge in his deepest desires before moving on. But he had been in such a rush that he ended up leaving anyway. Prince Kalyan declared that he would dedicate this second life to the original Kalyan, ensuring that all his wishes were fulfilled. He mused that, if this life had been a prison for the original Kalyan, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of envy for his newfound total freedom. Turning to Manazil, Prince Kalyan vowed that he would not end up living in ignorance. There were so many loose ends that the first Kalyan had left behind, and favors that had been requested of him. He would live his second life with dignity and purpose. Pabel's Night Corps was swiftly disbanded, with its members returning to Marquis Bresson. Romain advised them not to heed the baseless rumors circulating about the royal family. Meanwhile, King Elan announced the formation of a new mage corps. 3 months later, Kalyan and a maid discussed the urgent need to summon the tailor. Kalyan instructed the maid to inform the tailor that many of his clothes were in dire need of repair, and the ones he was wearing currently were already far too small for his growing frame. Prince Kalyan strode into the room where Romain and King Elan were waiting. Romain noted that Kalyan seemed to have sprouted up even more since they last met, remarking that the prince appeared significantly taller than he was just a year ago. King Elan asked if Kalyan had finalized the preparations for Rosalita. The prince replied that everything was squared away as his birthday approached. Manazil explained that there was someone he needed to introduce to Kalyan, which was the very reason for this summons. This would be the mage serving as his tutor during Rosalita. The man stepped into the room and introduced himself, declaring that it was an absolute honor to finally meet him. It was Arsène Hertz. Kalyan stared at him in horror. Romain added that Hertz was a remarkably talented figure who would be joining the Mage Corps. expressing his hope that Kalyan and Hertz would learn from one another and grow closer as time went on. Kalyan then retorted sharply, stating that this was quite the unexpected surprise, and quite the peculiar birthday gift. Kalyan asked when the Mage Corps would actually be formed. Elon replied that it wouldn't be anytime soon, as he didn't even have a head count yet, nor an official uniform. Nothing was set in stone, and the road ahead was long. It was only the beginning, Elon stated. While Hertz offered a thin smile to the prince, Elon asked Romain if he had any ideas for naming the Mage Corps. Romain seemed to have something in mind, as he had been pondering it for a while with a knowing smirk. Romain suggested the name Vulcan. Prince Kalyan seemed to approve of the choice as well. Elon remarked that it was almost as if Romain had been waiting for someone to ask, and that it would have been a real problem if he hadn't. Kalyan then pressed Hertz on what he thought of the name. Holding his teacup, the prince awaited Hertz's reply, who simply smiled and asked what he meant by that. Kalyan clarified he was talking about the name Vulcan, asking if he liked it or if it felt familiar. Elon glanced between Kalyan and Hertz. With a smirk, Hertz affirmed that it was a fine name. Elon raised a barrier and was floored to hear about the dark history between Kalyan and Hertz. He asked if he should revoke his recommendation. Kalyan replied that it wasn't necessary. Elon reasoned that if things were as Kalyan described, and the prince confirmed that Hertz was indeed the one who killed the first Kalyan, he understood that Hertz was different from his past self, just as the current situation was entirely different. However, he still felt it was a mistake to let things slide without further inquiry. Meanwhile, Hertz was shivering somewhere nearby. Kalyan turned his attention to Pauline, who greeted him. Kalyan said it had been a long time, and told Pauline to make herself comfortable. Prince Kalyan apologized for keeping his name hidden and arriving unannounced. Pauline expressed that she was deeply honored that Kalyan had sought her out. Pauline observed that Kalyan had never allied himself with the nobles until now. The fact that he visited her in secret showed a surprising level of consideration. To nip any wild rumors in the bud, Kalyan made it clear he wouldn't beat around the bush. He was getting straight to the point. He was there to collect his reward for saving Palun's life, and asked point blank what Palun Emporium was willing to trade. Palun replied that he'd actually been expanding his business recently, diving into the formal diamond trade. He was even swapping horses with the imperial family. But that wasn't the answer Kalyan was looking for. Palun admitted he still didn't have anything substantial to offer in return. Kalyan just flashed a smile at the Baron. Then he asked if Palun would be capable of handling something even bigger than the Emporium. The Baron replied that, with the right staff and capital, there wouldn't be any problem. Kalyan stated that he had the people and the gold needed, but he warned that the prison would have its own resources too. Palun then confessed he thought only Kalyan held that kind of power. A brief silence settled between them. Kalyan chuckled, agreeing that Palun had a point. Bryson had resources too. Palun countered that if they had the same level of wealth as Kalyan, Bryson wouldn't be an issue. Kalyan revealed his plan to form a troupe of mages. He had the funding and the manpower, but the real challenge was the administration. Palun asked if this was the reward for saving Kalyan's life. Kalyan just gave him a grin, saying he'd already received it, confirming this was the price for his life. That left Palun a bit uneasy, but he promised he'd get it done as quickly as possible. The prince reflected that his plan was working. He was supposed to have died after his 15th birthday, but he'd managed to rewrite his fate before that. Now he had people he could actually trust by his side. All that was missing was finding Sistine's will in Rosalita, and Kalyan couldn't help but wonder why all of this was happening. Arriving at his birthday gala, Kalyan took in the celebration prepared for him. He noted how flawless everything looked. Blanche was leaning against one of the hall's pillars. The prince walked over to strike up a conversation. With a smile, he approached Blanche and greeted him, saying it had been a long time since they last spoke. However, Blanche completely blew him off, and the prince just moved on. "Kalyan," Blanche called out, his eyes icy. Kalyan turned to face the second prince, who wore his usual bored, arrogant expression. The third Prince Kalyan declared he wouldn't tolerate such disrespect anymore, and that his name was Kalyan. With a smirk, he asked Blanche, "Kalyan?" Then Blanche declared that he wasn't the Kalyan he used to know. That caught the young prince off guard. Blanche went on to describe the Kalyan he'd seen recently, riding horses, wielding swords, and actually firing back. at whatever anyone said. He stepped right up to Callian and demanded to know who he really was. Callian was completely stunned by the question. He realized he couldn't just let his guard down. He was no longer the old king who lost his kingdom to Blanche. And this wasn't the Mad King. It was Blanche the man who ruined everything. He decided it was best to wait until he had Sistine's will in hand. Smiling, he told Blanche he was speaking nonsense. He kept that smile locked on his face while the second prince just stared at him with pure rage. Sometime later, the mage, chatting with Prince Callian, remarked that it made sense for Blanche to notice the change. Even if he was a scoundrel, he wasn't an idiot. The young prince looked at the mage looking confused. He asked, was Blanche really a scoundrel? The mage answered that yes, he was, and it was hardly a surprise. The prince gave a faint smile and said that was exactly how he saw it. Callian added that he'd been playing dumb, but Blanche clearly wasn't buying it. He asked what he should do to make him believe, just as he had claimed that he wasn't Callian. Callian agreed that the mage was right. He added that he really had said that, while the mage watched him thoughtfully. The mage thought to himself that even though Callian had declared he wouldn't live like Barum, that promise wasn't something he could just easily push to the back of his mind. The mage caught the young prince's eye and held out a ring, telling him that if ever Callian needed to reach out to an old man, he would be listening. Callian asked if the ring possessed some kind of communication magic. The mage confirmed it, explaining that he had infused a fragment of his own power into the ring. He warned that it wouldn't function in areas saturated with crystal energy like the castle, but it would resonate whenever a connection was possible. The prince thanked him, saying he loved feeling that connection to his master. Manasseh asked what was weighing on his mind, stating that everyone around them were good people, a faint smile playing on his lips. His apprentice questioned if the mage truly believed that. Sometime later, a man stepped forward, introducing himself as Commander Joran, leader of the Siegfried Knights. He went on to pledge that his knights would shield the prince until they reached the Sylvania nest, located deep within Siegfried territory. The prince couldn't help but feel a touch of irony. That was exactly the kind of show you'd expect from the Siegfried Knights. He never imagined the sheer scale of the protection. Jan, his servant, was actually the eldest son and young heir of the Siegfried family. Jan asked if His Highness required anything before they set off. The prince placed a hand on Jan's shoulder and said, "I need a drink." While Jan asked if plain water would do, the knight looked absolutely livid. The servant suggested a cup of tea instead if the prince preferred, and the prince agreed. Jan went to fetch it, and the prince thanked him. He then turned his gaze toward the knights, flashing them a casual smile. The knights looked furious that the prince was giving orders to Jan. Meanwhile, Manasseh Kyrie and Ina were stunned by the prince's audacity. The mage wondered why the prince was so recklessly making more enemies for himself. It was a rare chance to witness the true nature of Siegfried's resolve. In Sistania, the entire kingdom was celebrating Callian's birthday. Everyone had gathered for the Prince of Kyros's coming-of-age ceremony. Even Blanche was present, watching closely, though she didn't seem to be a fan of the queen. As for the queen, she was nowhere to be seen. She was busy having tea in her private quarters. Later, the prince rode his horse through the gathered crowd, his eyes locked with Manasseh's, and the two shared a knowing smile. The prince passed through a massive gate, and that was when the Rosalita mission began. He's already had one accident, so I'm genuinely worried. Wouldn't it be better if you went with him? The king asked calmly. The mage replied that there was nothing to fear, as he was more concerned about the prince inside the castle than out in the world. As he set his cup on the table, the king remarked that the mage was the same as ever, and that certainly wasn't a compliment. With a sigh, he asked if the mage was truly not worried at all. The mage thought to himself that for someone who usually worried so much, the king had been surprisingly different up until this point. The mage finally answered the king, stating that it wasn't, as if he had said anything wrong. The king exclaimed that that was exactly the kind of thing he was talking about. While passing through the forest, the prince grew curious about how the ring actually worked. He tried asking a few questions, but there was no response from the ring. Jan mentioned that he'd heard deliveries of flower garlands had arrived, and the palace was in total chaos. He suggested they keep talking so they wouldn't get bored. The prince remarked that Jan was responsible for the situation he'd been witnessing over the last few days, and was taken aback when his servant told him he was working hard just to talk to him. Jan turned to the knights and commanded them to listen up. He explained that the mage had declared Prince Kalyan to have absolutely no magical talent, and in terms of swordsmanship, he barely knew the basics of self-defense. That means he is as fragile and precious as a delicate flower, Jan declared. So you must do your absolute best to protect him. The knights looked deeply disappointed. As the young master and eldest son of the Siegfried family, Jan informed them that they were still about 2 to 3 hours away from the border. As Jan asked if they should take a break, Prince Kalyan caught a rustle from the forest and signaled for everyone to stop. In a flash, every knight had their blade drawn. They stood on high alert, locking eyes toward the sound. Kairi and the mage shifted into position, bracing themselves to guard the prince as they scanned the brush. Kalyan couldn't help but think they were being a bit too jumpy. Suddenly, a figure burst through the foliage. It was sprinting for its life, screaming for help. It was just a little elf. The creature was clearly petrified. Kalyan asked for its name, but the elf just blurted out that it was starving. Everyone was caught off guard. Softening his tone, the prince kindly asked if the little one had come looking for food. He pressed further, asking what it was doing deep in the woods. The tiny creature stammered that it was hiding, absolutely trembling with terror. A grim realization dawned on Kalyan. There's something strange about this conversation. One of the knights asked what their next move should be, and Kalyan replied that they needed to get some food for the elf. Just then the prince caught another sound, this time coming from deep within the trees. He snapped his head toward the noise and scolded the elf, telling him he should have warned them if someone was tailing them. Suddenly a man on horseback emerged from the woods. Prince Kalyan whipped off his cape and wrapped it carefully around the little elf. He ordered Kiri to keep him hidden. A knight stepped forward, demanding to know who the newcomer was. The guy claimed he was tracking a thief and asked if they'd seen a kid with an unusual appearance. The knight flatly denied seeing anyone and told him to beat it. But the stranger noticed Kyrie trying to hide something and insisted he wasn't looking for a fight with knights. He claimed he was only there to find someone and requested permission to search the area. Suddenly, flickers of light illuminated the forest. The knight was about to snap back, but the prince cut him off, asking exactly who he was hunting. The man described a young elf. In that split second, Kalyan gave the guy the green light to search. The little elf was absolutely terrified by the prince's permission. The stranger started closing in on Kairi, who was shielding the elf. As he passed Prince Kalyan, the prince told him not to look back. Just listen. The prince warned that the people following him weren't here to protect him. They were gunning for the man and the child. As soon as you verify the kid's identity, arrows will start raining down from that direction. Before the prince could even finish, the man whipped around, and right then he saw the light in the woods flare up. A volley of arrows whistled toward him, but they were shattered into pieces before they could hit their mark. Prince Kalyan had saved his life, using his blade to deflect the arrows and tackling the guy to the ground, to get him out of the archer's line of sight. Kalyan reminded the man, "I told you not to look back." More arrows tore through the air, and one of the knights screamed, "It's an ambush! Protect!" The prince. Right on cue, the mage Hertz cast the spell. He conjured a shield that deflected the incoming rain of arrows. While focused on his magic, Hertz saw the enemies retreating. The head knight ordered them to pursue, but warned them not to stray too far. Prince Kalyan figured that with the arrows stopped, the enemies had decided to bolt. The man noticed the prince had let his guard down. Meanwhile, Hertz grabbed the elf from Kairi so he could go and protect the prince. Rushing over, he asked if the prince was all right. Hertz shouted, grabbing the prince's attention, and the man seized the opening to attack. Kyrie screamed for the prince to watch his back. As the strike landed, the guy was stunned to see the young prince parry the blow with his small dagger. Without missing a beat, the prince unleashed a blast of magic, hitting the attacker square in the chest. The sheer agony sent the man collapsing to the ground, screaming in pain. The rest of the knights were left speechless by the prince's moves. They couldn't help but wonder, since when could the prince use magic? Jan raced over to the prince in a panic. He asked if he was okay, and felt relieved, muttering about how lucky they were, that things always turned out fine. Then he wondered why the prince had stepped forward when they had knights to handle the fighting, especially since Jan assumed the prince only knew a little basic swordsmanship and was useless with magic. The knights, however, could only replay the scene in their heads. They realized Jan's assessment was nowhere near the reality of what the young master had just shown them. The knights were left wondering exactly what kind of power. Just as Jan was calling out to the prince, he was already pulling off an incredible feat against an opponent only minutes later. The young elf looked absolutely terrified. The prince stepped toward her, pulled back her hood, and told her he wanted to talk. He studied her with a look of intense seriousness, even before he could even ask what she had stolen. The elf blurted out, "Lucas did it. I don't know anything." She kept blurting out answers before the prince even finished his questions, insisting over and over that she had no idea. She claimed she didn't know what was stolen, or why those scoundrels were pinning the blame on her. The prince rubbed his temples, clearly drained by the situation. He summoned the mage who arrived on cue. He gave the mage an order. "Organize everything she's saying," he commanded, "because it's like she's answering questions before I even ask them." The mage promised to get to the bottom of it. The young elf looked strangely happy, while the mage looked visibly stunned as he presented his report, explaining that she worked in the Iriska forest and her name was Tialis. "Tiano Reha," the elf interrupted, correcting him, and explaining that her name meant spirit of repressed words. The mage continued explaining that Luca the elf she was traveling with seemed to have swiped the object from the men who attacked them. She had gotten separated from Luca while the assailants were hunting her down. That was when she ran into the prince, and she herself had no clue why she was answering questions before he even asked them. Just as the prince tried to speak, the elf cut him off again, insisting, "That's not all. She really was something else." The prince finally gave up on talking and signaled for the mage to carry on. The mage walked off and the elf trailed right behind him, chatting away as if they were old friends. Meanwhile, Jan asked the prince what his next move was. The prince replied that she'd be sent away as soon as they parted ways. He'd drop her off near the forest with his servant. Jan asked if he was just going to leave the whole situation unresolved. The prince shook his head, saying he wouldn't get involved. They had a long road ahead and no reason to waste time on this. He decided he'd hand the investigation over to the nearest lord, just as Jan pointed out that they'd arrive by dinner time. Suddenly, the lead knight asked if His Highness had a moment. The knight explained that he'd found something suspicious among the attacker's belongings and asked if the prince wanted to take a look. The prince agreed, and the knight handed him something wrapped in cloth. As the prince unwrapped it, his expression shifted to one of genuine shock. Stunned, the prince asked if the attacker had been carrying this. The knight confirmed it was true. The knight asked if the prince recognized it. The prince muttered that it was impossible not to know what it was. It was the exact same poison he'd been forced to take once before. He decided he had to confront the attacker face to face. One of the thugs sneered, thinking the prince was just another pampered, rich young master. "From a wealthy family, I assume, but I guess that's not all, is it?" the attacker mused as the prince stepped closer. The prince looked him dead in the eye and said, "You're right. I am the son of a very wealthy family, and I'm very precious to them." Holding the poison up, the prince kept it short and sharp. "Do you have any idea what this is?" The attacker just stared back, completely clueless about what the prince was getting at. The thug shrugged. "We all had one. I thought it was valuable, so I pocketed a few." The prince pressed him on what he was actually looking for. The attacker admitted he wasn't really sure. When the prince asked who they were, the attacker claimed he couldn't see their faces through the masks. Jan tried to squeeze more out of him, but the man drew a blank. That's when the prince caught something off in the way the man was acting. He leaned in and noted that the guy didn't seem to be protecting his partners out of loyalty. He asked what the real problem was, promising to fix the situation if the man started talking. The prince demanded that the man put his faith in him. After all, who better to clean up this mess than the pampered son of a powerful family? The man was floored by the prince's sudden shift in attitude, and in a shaky whisper, he revealed his wife was being held at the Hansen village, and that the prince already knew it. The prince assured his wife that she would be safe, then demanded to know exactly what those invaders were after. The man described the object as a transparent marble, roughly the size of a fingernail. He admitted he wasn't entirely sure what it was, only that a priest from Tanzil would need to verify it to be certain. The young prince instantly realized this meant the invaders were hunting for a sacred relic. Sacred relics were used by the priests of Tanzil to tap into divine power. which explained why. Tanzel was desperate to hoard every single one they could get their hands on. The pieces finally clicked into place for the prince. However, he couldn't help but wonder how these invaders had managed to get their hands on that specific poison. It was the same lethal toxin that agents from Krisha carried, meant to be used as a last resort when a mission went sideways. The man claimed he'd obtained it through the White Eagle. He insisted he didn't know the true identities of the invaders, but he had overheard the title they used for their leader. The prince pressed him for the name. Blue Wagtail, the man replied. The prince stiffened. He recognized that name immediately. It was the name of one of Baron's father's pet birds. He wondered what on earth that individual was doing here. Later that day, deep within Lotland territory, rain was pouring down in relentless sheets. Inside, while speaking with the prince, the man remarked that perhaps the rain was a blessing in disguise, since it had stalled their progress since dinner. Setting his glass on the table, he insisted he had been eagerly awaiting this day. The man claimed it was a profound honor for him. This was Count Hailtim, Lord of the Atlan territory. The perpetually jovial Count continued. Let me see. In moments like this, it's almost as if the heavens are telling you to serve the prince. Even though the young prince felt the Count was talking far too much, he recalled the conversation he'd had with Jan earlier. Jan had asked if he remembered Count Hale. The Count was one of those who had sent him a gift in the past, and the prince distinctly remembered Hale's name on the recipient list, those who had received gifts in return. His servant had noted that although Hale was originally on Prince Randall's side, he had quickly switched his allegiance to Prince Blanche 6 years prior during the Great War of the Desert and Garlands. The prince realized this was the very opportunist he had sent a gift to. Count Hale, still brimming with excitement, kept rambling about how much he had looked forward to the prince's arrival. The prince guessed that Hale must have spoken with Blanche the year before. Malcolm Chadish, the Count's butler, looked visibly embarrassed by the Count's behavior. Hertz stepped through the doorway to request an audience, whispering to the young prince that they had captured the carrier pigeon. The prince knew they had been trying to tip off the blue wagtail about their presence. No other bird would be flying through such heavy rain and darkness for a mission like that. He asked the mage where he had been on such a freezing day and if he wanted a drink. The prince cut in, stating firmly that he wasn't interested in drinking. He needed to know if there was a Garland priest nearby. Count Hale fumbled, knocking his wine bottle over on the table. He flashed a nervous smile, apologized, and mumbled about being a bit drunk. He asked what the prince had said, and if he was really asking about a Garland priest. The Count turned hostile, snapping at the prince for even mentioning those wretches, claiming there was no way they could make it to such a remote location. The prince told the Count to compose himself, but the man continued to rant about how vile those wretches were, and that if the prince looked closely. Before the Count could finish his sentence, the young prince snapped his fingers and ordered him to sleep. The Count collapsed onto the table, instantly unconscious. Everyone in the room looked on in shock at the prince's display of power. He remarked that he simply couldn't tolerate the Count's insolent behavior any longer. Afterward, the prince appeared on horseback, conversing with Manassel through his ring. The mage asked if the prince was calling, that he was tangled up in some secret plot, and his life was now on the line. The prince continued reassuring Manassel that he shouldn't worry too much about his retreat. Manassel prodded him about the depth of the prince's connections. The prince replied that he was the type who had never once failed a mission. The prince added that it was impossible he hadn't realized he was the Prince of Karis. He wondered what kind of situation would force someone to risk using an arrow as an agent's tool. Manassel ordered the prince to find a spot near Latlan to house the priest Tensil. The mage added that he felt it was necessary to investigate what the secret agent was plotting with the priests. In a random bar, a woman was wiping down glasses and cups as Prince Kalion strode into the establishment. He greeted the woman, explaining that the individuals outside had simply been tailing him. The woman putting down the glass told him not to worry, saying she wasn't cruel enough to harm those who weren't involved. The prince remarked that he thought she had attacked them even, knowing exactly who he was. She countered that that was precisely why she had asked him not to intervene. The prince then noticed that everyone around them was knocked out cold. The woman remarked that he had been reckless. The prince headed to the counter where the woman stood and asked if he was involved now. The woman replied that she would say yes, but she peered at the prince and noticed the red aura surrounding him. The woman then concluded that this wasn't going to be easy. The prince offered a faint smile as he watched her. She asked if the elf she had been chasing was dead. The woman explained she had lost him while he was heading down the forest path. "If I had known it would be such a headache, I wouldn't have chased him in the first place," the woman declared. "This situation really rubs me the wrong way. But since it didn't cause us much harm, could you just leave?" the woman asked, adding that if he did, she would leave the elf child alone. The prince, picking up a drink, said that if she answered a few questions, he would take his leave. He asked her why she was hunting for a sacred relic. Glancing at her over the rim of his glass, he noted that she wasn't a priestess. The woman's expression turned sour. She snatched the glass from Kalian's hand and told him that lately, relics were fetching a high price. The prince then deduced that she was selling them off. The woman explained that her day job usually didn't pay well. The prince just studied her and asked if the buyer of the sacred relics was in Latlan. He argued that she had no reason to sell the relics inland, as it would be far easier to find priests in Karis. The woman replied that nobody paid more than this buyer and that it was also someone she had a connection with. The prince mused that if there was a connection, it could only be a secret agent. Someone selling intel on Karis, and now to pay for intel on the Blue Ladybug. Their agents were buying up sacred relics. The prince then noticed she had poured him some wine. He stared at the glass, thinking he would ask one final question. A bit further away in the royal palace, the king asked what the mage had come to request, and remarked that he was now being treated like an informant. Manasseh replied that he had gone there knowing the king would be awake, and that there was no reason to go through the trouble of confirming something the king already knew. He asked how many Tensel priests were in Karis, and where they were. The king then said he didn't know, if Manasseh already knew something and was asking because of that, or if it was just a coincidence. Manasseh's representatives came specifically because of this situation. Out of the 14 priests besides the one inside the palace, he wanted to track down and grab the rest, so he wouldn't have to ask for more priests. The king expressed his discomfort, saying that after sending them to celebrate what they had desired for so long, they acted as if Karis was just using their priests. Manasseh then declared that the situation with Tensel wasn't looking good. Manasseh asked they didn't reveal their situation, but they needed the priests, so what did the king do? The king replied that he needed to rejoin the others, though he couldn't help but wonder why the question was even asked. The mage explained that Prince Kalian was digging into the priest's location. The king found the prince's line of questioning incredibly suspicious. He puzzled over the motive behind such an inquiry, wondering, why on earth would Kalian be hunting for the priest, especially since he had already arrived where he needed to be? Back at the tavern, Kalian confronted the woman. He asked point blank if Count Atlanti was the buyer of the relic. The woman took a slow sip of her wine and murmured, "Who knows?" before concluding, "I highly doubt this is just a simple matter." The prince immediately returned to his horse, mounted it in a rush, and declared that the man's charade was over. He'd been hiding the priest, acting as if he knew absolutely nothing. It turned out, after snatching up relics at exorbitant prices, he'd been flipping that information to Secretia agents all along. Manasseh nodded, confirming the prince's suspicions were spot on. Kalian ordered that they return to the castle at once, his tone sharp with urgency. The mage noticed the sudden tension and asked if something was wrong. Kalian confirmed it, explaining that when he'd used magic to knock the man out during dinner, he had a gut feeling that Count Atlanti wasn't actually drunk. Meanwhile, at the Atlanti estate, a voice barked about how disrespectful the situation was, demanding to know how many times it had to be repeated. It was Jan. He was clashing with the butler, insisting the prince was just out for a stroll. But the butler wouldn't back down. He insisted he needed a word with the prince, claiming the count wanted to apologize for his earlier behavior. Jan cut him off, snapping at him. "Are you seriously trying to hide your own insolence?" Jan looked genuinely furious, railing at him. "Since when does a mere butler have the right to interrogate a prince's whereabouts?" The butler looked visibly shaken, completely frozen in place. Jan stood there deep in thought, considering the fact that the prince likely hadn't even returned yet. The butler pressed again, asking when the prince would be back. Jan shouted that he couldn't possibly know, and that he needed to clear out. At that exact moment, the prince appeared at the bedroom door and asked if he couldn't get a moment's rest. Both Jan and the old butler jumped in surprise. Kalyan didn't hold back, calling his servant incompetent. "I told you to come up with a decent excuse and send them packing. How hard can that be?" he asked, leaving Jan stunned. His servant had insisted on managing the situation himself. The prince then slammed the door shut. Outside, the butler saying he had no idea His Highness was resting and that he would take his leave. The prince leaned against the door, exhaling in relief. Then he flinched, realizing that he had sounded exactly like that person. A bitter taste lingered in his mouth. His servant stepped through the door, mentioning that the prince had returned. "Earlier than expected," the servant added, "and through the window no less." The prince replied that it was a long story. Jan asked if anyone else had been looking for him, or if anything suspicious had happened. Jan replied it was just that annoying butler again, though he noted, "It's a bit rich for a prince to be using windows as a front door." Jan concluded, recalling how His Highness had vaulted out of the third-story window earlier. Kalyan let out a soft laugh, saying he understood. The young prince then asked why Jan had been so hot-headed, noting that he hadn't seen him that irritated back at the palace. Jan replied that it was because the butler just wouldn't listen. Even after being told the prince was out walking, the butler kept hounding him. When will he be back? Kalyan found that logic strange. His servant explained that the butler seemed far more obsessed with the prince's return than his actual destination. A while later, the prince spoke with the mage, confirming that the count already suspected they were investigating something. He added that they were right to assume the count hadn't been drunk at all. The mage asked why. Kalyan explained that the count was merely putting on an act. The prince clarified that today was the scheduled date for the exchange of the sacred relics with the blue Mariquita. That explained the Mariquita's presence. The wine was just a convenient cover for the count to slip away unnoticed. So that explained why the Mariquita was there. The wine was just a convenient excuse for the count to slip away unnoticed. But the scheme backfired the moment Kalyan put him under. As soon as he found out I'd left the castle, he sent his butler to snoop around. "The prince?" the mage asked. Catching on, he questioned why he was so desperate for a sacred relic. Kalyan replied that he was likely planning to offer it as a gift, all to curry favor with Tanzil, the homeland of Prince Randall's mother. The mage added that everything, while playing nice with Randall, he's also flirting with Blanche and sending hush-hush gifts to Kalyan. Once the prince finished, he sold that inside info on Kiris to a secret agent from Secretsia. What a cunning snake. And just like that, the hunt began. Chased by the prince, the very man who had been hunting him, he tipped me off about the blue Mariquita, and that's how I figured out Ale was funneling relics to Tinsel, just to butter up Randall through that blue bird. If this isn't all just a wild coincidence, the prince trailed off, the rain won't let up until tomorrow. And since I'm stuck here, I'll deal with that traitor right in his own room. Ale shattered a glass in a fit of rage. He cursed himself for not realizing Kalyan would be such a thorn in his side. When the prince eventually returned the gifts, Ale was certain Kalyan had used some kind of magic. After all, only an enchantment could knock someone out that cold. His entire master plan was a disaster because of him. Acting so high and mighty just because he has Manassil in his pocket, who does he think he is? For someone of his station to think he's on the same level as royalty, what an absolute moron. Why didn't I just kill him before all this started? Isle fumed. I've worked so hard to build bridges with the nobles. I poured a fortune into the Marquis. He promised me those fertile lands on the edge of Karis. But thanks to Kalyan, everything's gone sideways, Isle roared. Just then the butler stepped in and asked for a word with the count. He flopped onto the sofa and demanded to know if the butler had managed to talk to the blue Mariquita. The butler admitted he hadn't, maybe later. In a blind rage, the count hurled his glass at the butler's head, calling him a useless fool. Ale snapped, asking if the butler could do a single thing right then, glanced at the pouring rain outside. It meant that the half-blood would be sleeping there again. The terrified butler asked if he should call off the deal. Ale, shaking with anger, growled that there was nothing else to be done. He couldn't risk it with the prince and his men lurking about. He barked at a maid to fetch his clothes, vowing he'd teach Prince Kalyan a lesson in manners. The next morning, Kalyan was sitting at the table calmly enjoying his breakfast. Count Ail just glared at the young man, thinking about how Kalyan was acting as if nothing happened. Here in Karis, the title of Count demands respect, Ail thought. The nobility won't sit idly by if they find out you used magic on me. Your royal blood won't protect you, you foolish little prince. You'll be begging for my forgiveness soon enough. Ail then apologized to Kalyan for his behavior the night before. The prince brushed it off, saying it was no trouble. The count then asked if an enchantment had been used. Before Ail could even finish the sentence, Kalyan coolly admitted he'd put him under with an enchantment simply because the count was becoming insufferable. With a faint smile, Kalyan told Ail not to worry, since it must be the first time he'd hosted a member of the royal family. He finished by saying the count must be feeling nervous. Count Ail forced a smile, but he was boiling inside, as Kalyan acted as if the whole mess was actually the count's own fault. Kalyan declared he was done investigating about the person who'd attacked him. The count asked if it was the man the prince had brought along. The prince replied that it was, and they'd gathered a mountain of information. The count thought he better find out more before Ail could even press for details. Kalyan dropped the name of the bird, which made the count spit out his wine. The butler, caught off guard, scrambled for a cloth to clean the count up. The count snapped at the butler not to touch him while he was speaking with the prince. Kalyan wrapped up by saying he still needed to dig deeper into the specifics, but he figured the count would want to know what exactly had gone down on his own lands. Count Ail stood up and insisted he would assist, claiming he'd never allow a prince to be attacked on his own turf. Do you really think I'd let you mess with my land? Just wait and see. I'll get to the bottom of this and expose your weakness, the count mused. Suddenly one of his knights approached and requested a private word with his highness. As the count watched the knight whisper into the prince's ear, he felt an urge to drive him far away from these lands. The prince cut through the count's train of thought, announcing that the message was actually intended for the count himself, a shock that left him stunned. Kalyan flashed a smile and told him the man was waiting to speak with him. They walked together until they reached a grim, prison-like cell. The count was seething, furious that Kalyan would drag him to such a hellhole. Meanwhile, the prince remained calm, knowing the count was likely feeling cornered, but everything had been meticulously staged to ensure he walked straight into the trap. The story flashed back to the previous night in that very same spot. The prisoner behind the bars begged to know if any harm had come to his wife. Kalyan assured him his family was safe, promising on his honor that no harm would touch them. The man then questioned why the prince was there, and Kalyan replied that surely the man could piece together the reason by now. The prisoner was a dead man walking for daring to attack a member of the royal family. Once the investigation concluded, he would be sent to Karis for execution. Even if he were somehow spared, the prince explained he would receive no treatment. His arm would rot from gangrene, and a painful death would follow. The man looked at him terrified, asking what the prince was getting at. Kalyan then offered him a lifeline. The man looked stunned. The prince continued promising he could live far from this territory, in a place where he could finally find peace, but only if he helped him. In exchange, Kalyan added, I will ensure your punishment is limited to just the loss of your arm. The man's face went pale with dread. The prince held his gaze icy and unyielding. The man finally gave in, desperate to know what he had to do. Back in the present, the man revealed that he had summoned the count because Marikita was actually a secret agent for Secretia. She was there to offload goods to a client she had been dealing with for a long time. The prince mused aloud that it was bizarre for such a relationship to last, especially when it involved a double agent, a treacherous merchant dealing in stolen secrets. Wouldn't you agree, Count? The prince asked, landing the final blow. The count looked completely shattered, unable to even form a coherent sentence. Kalyan stood in silence, waiting for the count to make his move, waiting for the one piece of proof he needed. Later at the palace, the butler knelt before the prince, begging for mercy. He insisted that everything he had done was merely following his master's orders. He didn't try to make excuses, simply pleading for the prince's leniency. The butler had assumed Count Latlin's secrets would be exposed, but he never saw this outcome coming. With a thoughtful tone, the prince asked the butler, "Are you a priest of Tansel?" That question left the butler paralyzed with shock. Kalyane pressed on, stating that the butler must be the one, buying and selling those relics. The only reason he had been so submissive to Count Latlin, he reasoned, must be because the Count held one of his darkest secrets. The butler confessed that if his superiors discovered he was trafficking relics, Tansel would execute him the moment he returned. Kalyane was taken aback, so the Count wasn't trying to buy them after all. He wondered, then demanded to know who the buyer was. The butler admitted he had sold them to Queen Celicia's older brother, Viscount Renaud Brisson. "He presents the sacred relics to Tansel," the butler explained. "Renaud Brisson has formed a secret alliance with Tansel. This meant he had betrayed Planche and thrown his lot in with Randall. He had turned his back on Celicia and the rest of his royal kin who supported Planche as the heir." Turning to the mage Manasil, the prince remarked that the trap he'd set for the Count had caught something far more valuable. The mage asked what his next move would be. The prince replied that it was time to make some noise, and asked if he should consult with Romain. The mage agreed. Kalyane had Mansil draft a letter to reach out to hail Atilin. Before that, the prince commanded his servants to tend to the arm of the man locked away in the dungeon. The wound was severe and would take ages to mend, so he suggested amputation. Then he ordered them to feed that man some food while holding up the poison. The knight acknowledged the order, promising to notify the prisoner. He also told Kairi to head to Hansen village, track down the man's wife, and bring her to safety. While the prisoner was being fed his medicine, the prince was interrupted by the young elf who burst into his chambers saying she'd brought Aina along even, without permission. Before the prince could even ask, the fairy pleaded with him not to scold Aina. She then scampered over to the little bird, and the prince figured it wasn't his concern anyway. She sidled up to the bird and started playing with it. Ian then questioned the prince about what he planned to do with the pigeon if he kept it around. Kalyane replied that he wouldn't be keeping it. Ian countered, asking if he was thinking about the moment he returned it to its owner. Aina joined in playing with the pigeon, while Kalyane and Ian just watched. Eventually, the prince told Aina he'd get her a bird of her own when they returned to the palace, since he had to return this one tonight. Aina tried to argue that Merlin might not be thrilled about having a bird in their room, but the prince just smiled and said that was a shame. He asked Aina to help him release the bird once he'd finished dinner, and he reminded her not to forget to open the window. Aina looked pretty skeptical. The prince then revealed he was expecting a guest. A few hours slipped by, and everyone had already cleared out of the prince's quarters. He was all alone, buried in a book. Suddenly, he heard a sound from the window. Closing his book, the prince remarked that his guest had arrived sooner than expected. The visitor admitted she was deeply unsettled by the letter's contents. It basically warned that if she didn't want her actions exposed to Ningxia, she'd better show up and talk. It was Mariquita Azul who had snuck in. She demanded to know why he was threatening her. The prince, pulling a document from his book, declared he had proof that Hale was trafficking relics and peddling secrets. He added, "Once you hand over that evidence, I'll keep your secret." She just stood there, staring at him in silence. He asked if that was her final answer, and she simply said, yes. She muttered that she hated messy entanglements. With that, she launched several magic projectiles at him. The prince was caught off guard, watching the magic orbs hurtle toward him, barely throwing up a protective barrier in time. He remembered how she used to be a swordsman back in the day. The projectiles ricocheted off and slammed into the walls with a thunderous crash. The knights outside scrambled, alarmed by the intrusion in the prince's room. Kalyane bolted the door and ordered them to stay out. He challenged the woman, asking if she'd really come to kill him, or if there was more to it than that. She stepped toward him, insisting she had no other intentions. She drew her blade and lunged at the prince, who barely managed to parry. He knew his standard-issue iron sword wouldn't hold up against her aura, and he had to end this fight fast without tapping into his own. The prince managed to land a strike, but she quickly retreated, using her blade to shield herself, until he eventually disarmed her. But just when he least expected it, she still had one more magic orb to attack him with. She hurled the orb right at him. It was moving too fast to block without aura, so he imbued his blade with it, managing to split the magic orb in two, but the stress shattered his sword completely. The woman, seeing that he had sliced the magical orb right in two, he asked if he was a master swordsman. They both fell silent, and the prince wondered what to do next. Then the prince called her by her true name, Ayla. She was visibly stunned, right as she was about to ask how he even knew her name. The prince gripped her face firmly as Ayla questioned his actions. He then pried her mouth open, peering inside. He declared that the poison that should have been there was nowhere to be found. Kalyan then demanded she tell him what she knew. Ayla asked if he would set her free if she spoke. I've heard that people who hold on to secrets are usually strong-willed. But I don't think that's the case for you, Kalyan thought to himself. The prince couldn't help but wonder if she had always been this way, or if she had changed over time. Ayla, in turn, insisted that it would be best if he just let her go. She went on to point out that a true master swordsman would carry a blade inferior to those of the guards, almost as if to hide his real skills. If you don't want to be exposed, send me away. Otherwise, I'll tell the knight outside. Exactly what I just saw Ayla threatened. In another timeline, Marakita Azul was loyal to her creation, a master swordsman devoted to Salam. But you aren't her, the prince thought. Then, grabbing her by the collar, the prince declared, if you're going to beg me not to die, then you shouldn't have died in front of me. Ayla was shaken by the prince's words, and in heavy silence fell between them. He stripped off her outer clothes and told her not to expect anything in return. That isn't a secret, valuable enough to cost you your life. He demanded she produce evidence and promised he wouldn't interrogate her further. The prince added that the interrogation would be handled by the White Eagle, which terrified Ayla. A little further away, a man cursed loudly. It was Count Hale, wondering where on earth Malcolm had gone, since he hadn't seen him yet. Malcolm had asked what happened and what was written in a letter. The letter stated that the Count would need someone to represent him. I explained it to the Queen. That's exactly what you've been selling all this time. So don't you worry, there's nothing to be concerned about. The letter had been written by Elon Menesil. The Count wondered if the mage already knew about the sacred relics. Elon concluded that if the mage had been the one to send the letter, he probably already knew everything. Who does that mage think he is, threatening me, he grumbled. It's so irritating to have to bow down to that damn commoner prince. He must think I'd come crawling to him, but he shouldn't have underestimated me. He thinks I haven't made any preparations in advance, Count Hale scoffed. Then he stepped into a room overflowing with treasures. Gazing at the wealth, he thought about how he could have gathered even more. Walking toward a safe, he muttered nonsense, knowing he possessed something far more precious. He opened a small box filled with relics, declaring that with so many he could amass a huge fortune. While he was rambling about his plans, Hertz began to materialize behind him. Just as the Count reached to close the box, it vanished right out of his hands. He spun around, saw the box in Hertz's grip, and gasped in shock. He asked if that was some kind of invisibility magic. Hertz just nodded, and revealed himself to be Prince Kalyan's mage. He said he was incredibly grateful because the Count had found the evidence with his own 2 hands, and added ironically that the Count shouldn't worry, since he would personally handle telling the damn crafty mage and the damn commoner prince himself. The mage then brought the sacred relic to Kalyan. Hertz informed him that he had also seized all the documents, containing information leaked by Karis, and regarding Hale's relic trade. The prince, wearing a smirk, thanked the mage, saying that thanks to him, the chaos was almost complete. Dan threw the door open in a panic, shouting for the prince to look outside. Then, knights in golden armor approached. It was a massive fleet of mounted men, riding on their horses. From his window, the prince caught sight of the king's own personal knight, Kayla. He couldn't help but wonder what those knights, the ones sworn to protect the king and Kairi, were doing all the way out here.